I mean, I feel personal. I feel like it's personal. I really do.
For perspective, the Latin Music Grammy Awards we just told you about, one of the many events canceled somewhere in the United States, thousands of miles from here. That event had recently been moved to Los Angeles from Miami due to security concerns. Fair question tonight. How exactly does one now define a safer place in the United States? Dan?
Jim Axelrod from high atop one of the buildings in Midtown, New York, which gives us an opportunity to remind you that television is a bit like a flashlight beam. It can show you what's at the end of that beam, doesn't show you what's at the side of the beam, up or below. And the television cameras have been pointed today at the targets, the World Trade Center here in New York City, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., all of those targets on the East Coast. So it's in wide areas of Manhattan, and most of Manhattan, which is only a part of New York City as a whole, while there was a lot of tension today and a lot of concern for what was happening, obviously, to the country and particularly on the lower part of Manhattan, that life did go on in most of the city. But all focal points have been and remain tonight on the dead and wounded out of what happened in lower Manhattan and in Washington in the case of the Pentagon. But officials up and down the West Coast found themselves scrambling all day, as well as officials here on the East Coast. Bill Whitaker has been keeping an eye on the West Coast developments. Bill?
Dan, even here 3,000 miles away, the terror struck deep. Airports, businesses, schools across the West closed down. People's reactions? A mixture of fear and anger. Fearing the nation's second largest city might also be a target, workers fled downtown high-rises, leaving the heart of Los Angeles a ghost town. With the Pentagon in flames, giant West Coast defense contractors, Boeing and Raytheon, sent Los Angeles workers home for safety's sake. FBI agents with fingers at the ready ringed the main federal building. City government, law enforcement, indeed the entire city was on high alert.
We believe that whatever could have happened in New York could very likely happen here.
The busy borders with Mexico and Canada intensified security and remained open, but little else did. Urban icons, the Transamerica Pyramid in San Francisco, even Seattle's Space Needle closed down, leaving tourists stunned.
To Pearl Harbor magnified 10 times.
There's heightened alert on the Golden Gate and Bay Bridges, San Francisco's main links. Even Disneyland, the self-proclaimed happiest place on earth, joined other California amusement parks and closed down in fear.
Obviously, what they want is to shut down the country, and that's exactly what they've done.
I mean, it's scary to think that something like this could happen in the United States. I mean, you feel safe here, and now you don't feel as safe.
The West's water and energy suppliers are taking no chances either. At Hoover Dam, boats and bomb-sniffing dogs are on patrol. Armed guards stand outside the San Onofre nuclear plant near San Diego. Up the road, Marine Camp Pendleton is on Threat Condition D, the highest level of alert, meaning an attack is expected or imminent.
Right now, they are checking every car that's on base, and we are restricting access if you're not a military affiliated.
This afternoon in Los Angeles, Muslim groups citing death threats said don't blame all for the alleged actions of a few.
The pain of this country is in fact our pain.
Saying there's clearly too much hatred, the Crystal Cathedral in Orange County invited people of all faiths to come together and pray for the victims of today's terror. So here, like the rest of the country, prayers for the victims and concerns for the country's future and safety. Dan?
Bill Whitaker reporting live from Los Angeles. The flow of casualties into New York hospitals has slowed tonight. The flow of casualties from the World Trade Center explosions earlier in the day. But the death toll is mounting at emergency rooms, and hospital officials say that they and we have yet to see a fraction of the dead and wounded. Let me repeat that for emphasis. The hospital officials say that they up to this moment, they haven't even seen, they've seen only a fraction of the dead and wounded, which gives you some idea of what we need to be prepared to face in the days to come. Dr. James Dillard, a pain specialist who usually works in the Columbia Presbyterian Hospital system, but was sent to St. Vincent's Hospital near the World Trade Center to help, said, and I quote him, I have been in here since this morning. It is like a normal busy day, but it is eerie. We expected to get overwhelmed. It is surreal inside, but there are no sick patients. I think so many people are dead. It's a bad sign that there are no mass casualties, meaning wounded. The doctor saying he sees a lot of dead people, more dead than wounded. Fires continue to rage at the scene of the attacks at the 110-story Twin Towers. The fires have ebbed and flowed during the day, but they're still burning. Much of this prevents police and rescue personnel from getting to the wounded or dead. This is according to witnesses on the scene and our own CBS News correspondents. There are believed people trapped in the rubble, the debris from the collapse of the 3 buildings at the World Trade Center, the 2 Twin Towers, and then World Trade Center building number 7. But police, firemen, and other rescue workers have been unable to get to most of those people who are known to be trapped in the rubble. How many of them, we don't know. Some 50,000 people work in and around the World Trade Center. Many other thousands visit it during the day. All of that contributes to this eerie mood in New York City, and particularly in Lower Manhattan this evening. With us is Fouad Ajami, the distinguished professor at Johns Hopkins University, an expert on the Middle East, and for that matter, an expert on terrorism. Well, as hard as it is to say it, Fouad Ajami, whoever these evil people are who perpetrated this cowardly attack, in many ways they got what they wanted.
Well, they've succeeded. I think we are vulnerable to this kind of new form of warfare that we've been talking about this afternoon together, and you've been talking about. And they have dramatized our vulnerability. And I think to the extent that there is a political message, because if the trail takes us in the direction of Osama bin Laden and his group and the recruits that he finds, then the message is to dramatize our similarity with and affinity with Israel. Because we've been seeing, if you will, a trail of terror hit Israel now for a good deal of time, and now we are victims of the same phenomenon. The idea is to underline the oneness, the similarity and the alliance between these two societies. But unless this trail goes cold, and you've been underlining this to us over and over again, unless this trail goes cold, we are really talking about bin Laden and his people, and that's what the reports from Jim Stewart and others have been coming your way.
Well, 2 points. One, as Anthony Mason reminded us, it isn't just the symbolism of the attack now. It has hit the United States at its economic core.
Absolutely.
And what happens when the financial markets reopen, they're not supposed to open tomorrow, maybe not the day after. But it's a hammer lick at so much, but it includes a hammer lick at our economy.
Of course, I mean, the whole idea is our imperium, if you will, is of the NASDAQ variety. We have been happy with our economic performance in the 1990s. We sit astride the world. Our economy is so successful. Our job creation is so successful. There were even arguments that said, now politics is finished in the world. It's now the primacy of geoeconomics. And look at the primacy of geoeconomics. 4 men get on 4 aircrafts and do this to a great, proud, successful nation.
That was in the case of the USS Cole. Today, there's never been a terrorism attack on this scale anywhere in the world.
Absolutely not. But you see, if indeed we go back to this bin Laden base and his group, the so-called Al-Qaeda, which is his followers, these people have grown more brazen and more reckless by the day. The first attacks, to the extent that we can pick up his trail, were the attacks against the U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, then the attack on the USS Cole, then this. And we've made threats, and we have targeted bin Laden. But these have been pinpricks. There has really been no big price paid for attacks against Americans. I think President Bush is going to be under huge pressure, in effect, to now make good on these threats. This has to be retribution beyond the old raids of the past, if and when we get the trail down right and we know exactly who did this.
If we get the trail down right, and I am going to underscore again, we don't know who did this.
Yes.
Osama bin Laden, his name has been on everybody's lips.
Yes.
But there's no, so far as I know, empirical evidence
Yes.
that he's connected to this. The suspicion runs strong, but we've said before, it was said after Pearl Harbor, or to praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. We're now in a position to praise the Lord and let's get some information.
Right. Well, we'd have to unseat the Taliban regime. I mean, this would be, let's be clear about if the evidence and the trail leads us in the direction of bin Laden. And if bin Laden, as we know he is in Afghanistan, you can make a safe bet that the President and the Secretary of Defense and an administration which came in pledged not to be as soft in the world as Bill Clinton was for the 8 years he was around. There will be enormous pressure to unseat the Taliban regime, to go out and find bin Laden, because bin Laden, we know, is in Afghanistan. Then the pressure will be on this enormous military machine we have, that we have to be protected, and that there is a regime in the world, in many ways friendless, even in the world of Islam. Even the Iranians have no use for the Taliban. They hate them. They think that the Taliban are a disgrace to the world of Islam, and they've criticized the Taliban. So here is this Taliban regime, a regime of radical seminarians. That's what they are. Caught in a war in their own country, over their own country, and you know the land, you've done journalism in Afghanistan. Here is this land which had become a land of brigandage. And now there will be pressure to go out to the source, and the source is the Taliban and the regime.
Fuad Jami, thanks. The President of the United States will be speaking to the nation and the world in about a half hour. You're watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Bair. We're continuing our coverage of local reaction and response to the attack on America. The military bases here remain on high alert. Jacksonville Airport is closed by order of the Federal Aviation Administration until at least noon tomorrow. School is still scheduled tomorrow for all counties. Governor Jeb Bush declared a state of emergency in Florida today. The governor calls it a preemptive action, which means that he wants the nation's or the state's National Guard and government to be ready in case any terrorism touches Florida. Now, this story affects everyone. And Sam Kovacs joins us now with how it's impacting a prominent Jacksonville figure, Coach Tom Coughlin.
That's exactly right, Mary. As you just heard Fuad Jami and Dan Rather talk about, it's a direct attack on the American economy, much of it centered at the World Trade Center. 50 floors of the World Trade Center are occupied or were occupied by Morgan Stanley Dean Witter, one of the major financial institutions in the United States. Tom Coughlin's son, Tim, works at Morgan Stanley, and today was finally contacted by the coach. Coughlin told us this afternoon, quote, "My son Tim works for Morgan Stanley on the 60th floor at the World Trade Center in the building that was hit by the second plane. My son Brian was able to reach Tim on his cell phone as he was on the 29th floor going down the stairway to leave the building when both buildings were being evacuated. At that time, Tim did not know that the second plane had crashed into the building in which he worked. I spoke with Tim when he got to street level and again later in the day. He got out safely, and my family and I thank God for that." It is one of the many stories, of course, that will be coming out of the New York area of people who were there. In fact, I spoke to my brother, who was in Lower Manhattan today when all this happened, and said, in fact, it does resemble a war zone. It has affected many sporting events. The PGA Tour has already postponed Thursday's first round of the World Championships at Belle Reve in St. Louis. The Ohio-North Carolina State game, the Penn State-Virginia game, the Ohio State San Diego State games this weekend have already been postponed. Florida Volleyball's match tonight has been postponed. All Major League Baseball games have been put off tonight. All racetracks throughout the United States are closed this evening as well. I spoke to Steve Spurrier, the head coach at Florida today, as well as Jeremy Foley, the athletic director at the University of Florida, who both said that they were going to wait until tomorrow to be a part of a decision-making process. Most conference commissioners met tonight by conference call and tried to give an update on exactly where they would be. It'll be tomorrow, and that's what the head coach at Florida said, before they make a decision about this coming Saturday's game with Tennessee.
I'm sure today we all need some time out. Probably everybody, all Americans need a little time out here and plan our course and how we all feel tomorrow and the next day. Then we go from there.
Spurrier said that it was important that people get a message that they cannot disrupt our way of life at this point, but he wasn't sure whether the team would practice today, but he would explain to them what the ramifications are throughout the day. By the way, the United States government will have the authority, according to athletic directors and conference commissioners, to decide whether or not teams can travel by air and whether or not there can be large gatherings of people, much the same situation that happened in World War II. And finally, 2 scouts from the Los Angeles Kings have been confirmed among the dead who were on the second plane that hit the World Trade Center as they headed back to Los Angeles.
That's terrible. It stands to reason, though, that when we're talking about huge gatherings of people and traveling by air, that sports would be affected by this.
It certainly would be, and of course the fact that air travel is such a prominent part of what sports competition is, and as many conference commissioners said tonight in their conference call, it's very difficult for players or even administrators to consider, let's go get on a plane and go somewhere to play somebody when you have a national tragedy like this. They'll make decisions tomorrow as to whether or not this weekend's games will be disrupted. Already, some have been canceled and others have already been postponed.
So many families, though, breathing sighs of relief after this terrible tragedy, but families like Coach Coughlin.
Well, the Coughlin family is one of the absolute stories about exactly what happened. Tim's coming down. He's on the 29th floor. His brother gets him on the cell phone. It's pretty amazing.
Thanks, Sam. We'll continue to provide updates throughout the night, and we'll have a special one-hour edition of Eyewitness News tonight at 11 o'clock. And at 8:30 tonight, President Bush is scheduled to address the nation. Now, for the latest updates, you can log on to our web channel. That's news4jax.com. We now rejoin the CBS coverage.
Panic as Americans try to understand the scale of today's events.
From Buckingham Palace to Beijing, there was shock and sympathy. From the Vatican to the Kremlin, Russian President Putin called for a coordinated effort against terrorism. So did British Prime Minister Tony Blair.
We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy. And we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
More than not just resting, in Britain they were rattled. Offices closing early in London's financial centre, commercial air traffic over the capital banned, as airlines here and throughout Europe cancelled transatlantic flights.
I'm certain in the short term we're going to face a much more restricted world, a world which is much more security conscious, much more anxious, and much more fearful.
With European TV broadcasting live and non-stop, European governments called emergency meetings. So did NATO. Another echo of the attack in America were the questions asked here. Who was behind it and what happens now? The Taliban regime's ambassador to Pakistan today was part of the chorus calling for justice. He also insisted Osama bin Laden wasn't behind it. Bin Laden's not in contact with anyone, the ambassador insisted, and couldn't carry out such activity. It would be a great risk, he warned, for America to retaliate before completing an investigation. While Britain's calling mass terrorism a new evil the world needs to fight, some Europeans are more blunt. Germany calls the attack a declaration of war against the civilized world. But what all the allies are saying tonight is that America's not in this fight alone. Richard Roth, CBS News, London.
As we await President Bush's address to the nation and the world, which will be coming up in about 23 minutes now on the half-hour mark, joining us here in New York again is Sandy Berger, who served as National Security Advisor to President Bill Clinton, and in our CBS News Washington Bureau, Democratic Senator Christopher Dodd of Connecticut. Thank you both for being with us. First, Senator Dodd, there's been an awful lot of talk today about the United States. We will find who's responsible for this and we will punish them. Why is anybody who hates the United States, why would they believe this when in the past we have proven time and again we can't find out who the people who do these things, and we've been unable to punish them, really?
Well, first of all, Dan, let me step back for a second and tell you my thoughts, and I'm sure the thoughts of Sandy. I just left about 500 members of Congress on the east front of the Capitol with the leadership, Republicans and Democrats, joined together in expression of solidarity and sympathy for the literally hundreds of people, and I expect thousands who may have lost their lives today. We don't know the numbers yet, as you've reported accurately here, but it's hard to begin any discussion of this without talking about these families and what our country has gone through. And today, you used the language at the outset of your news tonight, using Franklin Delano Roosevelt's language almost 60 years ago, 12 weeks from now, calling this a day of infamy, and it truly is. So I wanted to begin there, and Tom Daschle and Trent Lott are going to have tomorrow a session on resolutions and an opportunity for us to be heard. Congress will be in session tomorrow. Democracy will always triumph over terrorism. And I hope here that we'll first of all concentrate on the tragedy here at home, do what's been suggested by some of your earlier guests, and find out exactly who is responsible here. And I'm confident we can do that. and go a step further here. And I'll be interested in what Sandy has to say about this, but I think a new chapter's been turned here. Too often we have sort of accepted other nations' notion that they would harbor these people, occasionally provide some financing, even training for them, and that they sort of had to do that for their own domestic security. I think those days are over with. I think any nation that supports, harbors, trains these individuals, whether it's Osama bin Laden or others who are responsible for it, there needs to be a collective response. You heard today President Putin. I think the Chinese made similar statements. This is a chance for the civilized world now, if nothing else comes out of this, to respond in the most aggressive and thorough way we can. This cancer is hitting all of us, and we need to respond to it accordingly.
Now, back to the original question, Senator. Are we capable of determining who did these things? And then are we capable of, in some way, finding them, bringing them to justice, punishing them?
I believe so. I think, first of all, this was a highly coordinated, very sophisticated attack here today. And I'm quite confident that the collective intelligence efforts of our allies, friends who have expressed support for us today, that we'll be able to determine that. We may not do it as quickly as some would like, and my hope would be that we'll do it smartly. It's very important that we know what we're talking about before we respond. But I'm very confident we can do it, and I think we have the means of doing it. It may not be as fast as some would like, but I believe it can be done.
Sandy Berger, where are those voices in the world of Islam? Islam being one of the world's great religions. Where are those voices? Are there any, in any place that counts, who say, listen, we've had enough of this, and we will help the United States find and bring to justice these people?
Well, I think we have to be careful, Dan, that we don't condemn the world of Islam here. Obviously, there are a billion people who practice Islam around the world. This is perpetrated by a group, and we need to deal aggressively with the group. But I agree with Chris. We need the cooperation and concerted effort of all of our allies and friends, whether they are in Europe, whether they're in the Arab world or elsewhere, because we are now in a new phase of this war against terrorism. This is a watershed event, and we're not going to deal with this in one fell swoop. This is going to require a sustained, serious operation. And I think it's time for the American people to support the president, buckle our seatbelts, because this is going to be a long, hard ride.
True or untrue that in the past when there have been terrorist acts, nothing on this scale has happened, but there have been terrorist acts, many of our friends and, yes, allies in the Arab world and elsewhere have been afraid to help us respond beyond a certain point because of fear of instability in their own countries.
Well, I think that's true, but this is so qualitatively different than anything we have seen before that we'll quickly decide, we'll quickly know who stands with the terrorists, who stands with disorder, and who stands with a world in which this kind of act is not tolerated. And I think we're going to have to put some of our friends to the test on this.
Senator Chris Dodd, what are the options for the president in increasing the pressure on, yes, our friends and allies to help more, great deal more and faster to deal with the people who perpetrate these kinds of crimes?
Well, it's hard to find any silver linings in what has occurred in the last 12 hours. But if there is any at all, it may be what we've heard already from leaders from around the globe that we haven't heard from in the past when we faced acts of terrorism not on this scale. And I would hope the president would pick up that phone. I'm confident he will. And by the way, all of us stand with him tonight. Anyone who's questioning whether or not this country is divided at all on this issue ought to put those notions aside. Democrats, Republicans, regardless of people's political feelings, we stand behind this president. He's our leader, and if he asks us to do some things in the coming days, he's going to find a united Congress, in my view. But he should also, I would hope, reach out to the allies who've spoken today, and even some of our major competitors in the globe who face similar challenges. This is a cancer that affects all of us, and I'm very confident if he does. There's been a lot of criticism about the administration in the first 8 months or so on the Kyoto agreements and on various other international efforts that we seem to be backing up. In a sense, I hope the president now realizes how important it is, I'm confident he will, that he reach out to these leaders and form that kind of coalition that, as Sandy has said, and he's absolutely right about this, systematically deals with this in the coming years. It's not a one response to this. It's not one attack. It's not going to be solved by one particular raid. This has got to be a systematic, seamless garment that goes on for a long time.
Sandy Berger, in the past, our history, the history of this country, shows that we're sometimes slow to recognize a danger. The build-up to World War II comes to mind. But when there is a Pearl Harbor, or when we're attacked, almost pushed off the Korean Peninsula, once we mobilize as a people, that we are indeed a determined and effective adversary, but we're dealing with such a shadowy operation as these terrorist organizations. Is it capable to put the nation on a one nation united, let's solve this problem, let's defeat this enemy, or impossible?
I have no question that the president can do that, but I think the American people need to understand that this is not going to be solved with one missile attack. We may have to reach deep into a faraway place in a very robust way to deal with this problem. We may have to do this over a sustained period of time, and those actions themselves will have their own consequences. So there's no silver bullet, literally or figuratively here, that is going to deal with the kind of unspeakable evil that we've seen today, the escalation in a massive way, both in terms of capability and malevolent intent that we've seen today. What we need now is buckle down, a serious, concerted effort that's going to have to be long range. We've taken down terrorist organizations like Abu Nidal in the 70s. This is qualitatively different, and we're, I think, capable of doing it. I think the American people will support the president, but it's going to take actions we may not have contemplated in the past.
Sandy Berger, Senator Chris Dodd, thank you very much. We're less than 15 minutes away now from the President of the United States addressing the American people and the world about the events of today. In the meantime, let's remind ourselves there were many scenes of heroism as well as horror in the Twin Towers attack here in New York City. CBS's Lee Cowan reports on the people in the streets amid rubble and chaos. I warn you in advance, caution you in advance of the violence in some of these scenes. With that in mind, Lee?
Well, Dan, I think anyone down here this morning will tell you that there simply wasn't any time to do anything. Wasn't time to think, wasn't time to breathe. Certainly there wasn't time to mourn. The only thing you could do is run, and if you could, help.
For those inside the World Trade Center, it wasn't just hell on earth. For Bob Fox, it was hell 39 stories up.
It was unbelievable. I was on the 39th floor about 8:45 when a tremendous explosion hit.
Those lucky enough to get out walked out of one danger right into another. A moonscape of ash and debris, smoke and fire, leaking gas, and already the smell of death.
Debris, smoke, all the dust, everything, just couldn't see nothing. And I was praying to God then that, let me get by this now.
Ironworker Tony Cabrera rushed toward the carnage to try and help.
Then I seen the second plane hit. And I went into this lobby. And I went into the lobby. I was there with the fire department and everything, and just, it was starting to give away. This and that, pieces of people coming down, parts, and whatever.
Never seen anything like it.
Never.
Rescuers were at a loss. Smoke so thick they couldn't see the damage. The clamor of falling debris so loud they couldn't hear the cries for help. All of it made worse when the first of the Twin Towers came tumbling down upon them.
Let's go! Let's go! After the first series of explosions, there was hardly time to get in, and those that did were right in line of fire for the next series of explosions.
As the second tower collapsed, Val Coleman had a front row seat to disaster, watching it all unfold out of his apartment window just 5 blocks away.
In a great blossom of flame, a huge red fireball scared the hell out of me.
Val Coleman was inside the World Trade Center just 15 minutes before the initial attack and remembers the last person he talked with.
A very nice young man answered me very politely. I left, came back here, and boom, he's probably dead.
And as he sat watching the building burn, Coleman could see tiny black specks near the top floors. They were people jumping off instead of being burned alive.
I must have seen 10 or 15 people come down, one after another.
Off the top?
Off what appeared to be the top.
The bombings today brought one horrific scene after another.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
But rescuers know once they get closer to what's left of the Twin Towers, the images are sure to get worse. But the workers, for many of them, though, they are still waiting. We are told now, Dan, that firefighters are trying to stretch ladders out across some of the debris to begin putting out some of the fires that have been burning all day long. But active search and rescue efforts are still on hold at this hour. There is still hope here tonight. But for the moment, it's being tempered by an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Dan.
Lee Cowan, one of our many reporters covering in Lower Manhattan. The terror attacks on the World Trade Center struck deep into the hearts of New Yorkers. Many were witness to or victims of this cowardly act of mass destruction. CBS's Mika Brzezinski has been out among them on the streets of New York.
There was terror in the streets while the Twin Towers burned. With gridlock on the ground, crowds watched from afar and prayed.
You don't see people jumping from the windows.
Police jumped into action, moving the crowds behind police lines, away from danger.
Let's go!
But not far enough. One after another, the towers fell to pieces, debris falling onto hundreds of onlookers. Somewhere behind the billow of smoke, an American icon had disappeared, transforming the New York skyline forever. On the sidelines, people watched and wept. Others, covered in soot and debris, counted their blessings. Even now, no one can guess the number of dead and wounded. Adding to the confusion, cell service was crippled, cutting the lifeline for families trying to locate loved ones. Only a few could get through. Nearby schools evacuated so quickly parents had no idea where to go to find their children. Everywhere there was terror and confusion.
Everybody please start walking towards the east side.
Finally, people simply walked away from Lower Manhattan. An eerie calm prevailed as police evacuated the area. Cell phone service for much of New York City is still somewhat crippled, though the situation is getting better. Several forms of transportation have been affected. Several subway lines are suspended indefinitely, and train service out of the city is limited. It will be no business as usual for school kids in New York City tomorrow. All New York City public schools are closed, at least for tomorrow. And the mayor of New York said earlier today, stay home and stay calm. At least try. Dan.
Mika Brzezinski. The specter is being raised tonight of hundreds and perhaps thousands, that's a quote from one New York City official, hundreds, perhaps thousands of people being, in effect, buried alive by the avalanche of destruction which developed in the wake of the two planes hitting the World Trade Centers today. Keep in mind that some rescue workers, firemen and policemen early on the scene were believed to have been killed. They've been unable to put out all the fires, much less get into the rubble and look for possible survivors in the rubble. That's the reality of this dark night in New York City. Now an eyewitness report from one of our own. Minutes after the initial attacks on the World Trade Center towers, CBS News correspondent Carol Maureen was on the scene, just in time for a frighteningly close encounter with catastrophe.
As I'm making my way toward the Trade Center along the water line, thousands of people were walking towards me, streaming out, almost not talking, trying to get through on cell phones that didn't work. Some of them crying, all of them looking pretty agonized. All of a sudden I heard a roar and I saw one of the towers blow and then collapse and fill the horizon with smoke, and I yelled, "Oh my God." And I saw from street level, as though it had exploded up, a giant rolling ball of flame, and the firefighters screamed, "Run." And I turned to run, but I fell, and I felt someone scoop me up, tell me to throw my high heels off, and I was running in my stocking feet with him. And finally, as we ran and ran, he slammed me into a wall and covered my body with his. I could feel his heart beating against my backbone. And I think both of us were sure we were dead, because there was no way you could run fast enough and there was no way to avoid it. But somehow we escaped the flame, which was immediately followed by a storm of debris. We were breathing, it felt like giant particles of plaster, and there was smoke, so that if you tried to put your hand out in front of you, you couldn't really see it. It was the thickest, most intense particle and smoke I've ever been in. And somewhere along the line, the firefighter handed me off to a New York police officer. The thing that struck me, though, was that I didn't see many wounded people in the street, which led me to believe, at least where I was by the Trade Center, they had never even gotten out of the building. I thought I was going to die. It is as close as I've ever come as a reporter to thinking I was going to die.
Carol Maureen of 60 Minutes 2, CBS News correspondent. The shock of this morning's attack on America wasn't just felt in the cities where the hijacked planes were crashed. It was also felt in the cities where those flights began. CBS's Wyatt Andrews is in Boston tonight.
At Boston's Logan Airport, where two of the hijacked planes originated, scores of relatives of the victims were met by airline officials for consolation and were then taken to a nearby hotel to await information. American Airlines lost its Los Angeles-bound Flight 11, and the airline confirmed the identity of its lost pilot, Captain John Oganowski, who was 52 and a 22-year veteran of the airline. Outside his home in Drake, Massachusetts, the captain's extended family gathered, including his wife and 3 daughters. Oganowski's brother Jim described him as a hero, a man who joined the Air Force out of patriotism during the Vietnam War and who viewed his work as an airline pilot his life's dream.
Our family is obviously grieving, as is the whole nation, for what has happened today. I personally, I think I'm in shock. I'm in some type of denial.
Official information about how the flights were seized and how Logan's security might have been breached is still under investigation and is closely held. Airport officials stress that security inside Logan's terminals, as elsewhere across America, is the responsibility of the separate airlines and that the airport itself was secure.
We've closed the airport to all arriving and all departing flights. We've increased our security measures. We've shut down all the construction sites within Logan Airport, both airside and landside.
At the Oganowski home, official information is also apparently scarce. The pilot's brother Jim told reporters that the family had no information about what Captain Oganowski went through or whether there were any communications between the pilot and FAA controllers. Wyatt Andrews, CBS News, Drake, Massachusetts.
Wyatt Andrews reporting from Boston. Dateline Philadelphia, Victor Saraceni of a Philadelphia suburb of Makefield Township is believed now to have been the pilot of the second plane to crash into the World Trade Center buildings. Also, Dateline Washington, it's now being said by the top Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Orrin Hatch, that there were some intercepts of some information that he says, quote, included people associated with bin Laden who acknowledged a couple of targets were hit. Hatch said this just a short while ago in an interview with the Associated Press. He declined to be more specific. As the president's speech approaches, let's go back to Washington and CBS News Chief Washington correspondent Bob Schieffer. Bob? Well, let's go to John Roberts quickly instead. Quick check off the line of scrimmage here. John Roberts, now back at the White House, allowed on the White House grounds. We're just a few minutes from the president making this, which by acclamation would be by far the most important speech of his presidency.
I would certainly say so, Dan, and this is also an enormous test for this new president. White House officials came out today and said that they would identify and bring to justice those responsible for these heinous acts, Dan, but with the scope and the enormity of this tragedy, I would imagine that just bringing them to justice is certainly not going to be enough for a lot of people. There will be a lot of people who are demanding swift, decisive, and punitive action against those responsible. We're told that in the president's address tonight, he will not even approach the issue of retaliation. He will offer words of resolve and reassurance, and he will express his condolences for the families of the victims of today's massive tragedies. And as you have said on and on throughout this day, Dan, we can't even begin to imagine how many people have died. Sources close to protecting the president say this was, in fact, just like Pearl Harbor, in that they had no indication that anything like this was afoot. There were no targets, if you will, that had come up on their very sensitive radar screen. And Dan, it would seem that the 2,400 and some odd people who died in Pearl Harbor may be eclipsed by today's tragedy. The president expected to speak from the Oval Office in just a few moments' time.
John Roberts, live from the White House. We'll be going back to the White House very shortly. There are no exact casualty figures. There are no figures even remotely exact from the World Trade Center bombings, or for that matter, at the Pentagon. In the few seconds we have remaining before the president speaks, let's go now to Bob Schieffer in Washington. Bob?
Well, Dan, the president will address a Congress and I think an audience of Americans. It will be a different group than he might have addressed last week. We had this incredible show of bipartisan support just a few minutes ago up on the Capitol steps, where you saw hundreds of members of Congress come together and say, we support the president. We are going to support the president to do whatever is necessary to find whoever did this and to see that they are punished. It's the sort of thing you almost never see except in times of crisis. And we saw again today what you always see in times of crisis with the American people and their representatives in Congress. They come together as one. I think the president will get a very good reception for whatever he says tonight.
Bob Schieffer in Washington. President Bush is going to address the nation in about a minute. As we wait for that, search and rescue operations stretch into the night here in New York City, hours after terrorists slammed two hijacked commercial airliners into the World Trade Center on the lower part of Manhattan Island. The Twin Towers, where 40 to 50,000 people work on their average day, crumpled to the ground. The full extent of death and injuries unknown. A fire department union official said, firemen's union official said earlier this evening that there may be as many as 200 New York City firefighters may be among the dead. One reason for that is when the first building was hit, firefighters were rushed to the scene, and then of course very quickly the second building was hit, and then fairly quickly after that both buildings collapsed. A third building in the Trade Center complex collapsed this evening. A third hijacked plane, of course, was slammed into the seat of America's military might, the Pentagon, and estimated at least 100 dead and or injured there. A fourth jetliner possibly being diverted to Washington or Camp David, the president's retreat, went down in southwestern Pennsylvania. All told, at least 250 people are aboard the four crashed planes. The FAA grounded all civilian aircraft until at least noon tomorrow. The Wall Street markets will be closed tomorrow. Now, President Bush was flown secretly today from Florida, first to Louisiana, then to Nebraska, but he's back in the White House now, and we have about 25 seconds till you will see President Bush address the nation from the White House. After the president speaks, our CBS News continuing coverage of events on this horrible historic day will continue.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature. And we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
President Bush speaking live from the Oval Office in the White House. Perhaps ominously, among the things the president said was, and this is not a direct quote, but it's on the money, we will not differentiate between those who committed these acts today and those who harbored them. The president vowed that no act of terror will darken America's beacon of freedom. We go down to CBS News Chief White House Correspondent John Roberts. John?
Dan, important words for the president to say that we will not differentiate between the terrorists who committed this act and those who harbor them. If this was, in fact, Osama bin Laden's group who was behind this, that message is aimed directly at the Taliban government. Though we should point out, Dan, that every indication we get from the White House tonight is that the explosions that we saw in Kabul tonight were not part of any American action. The White House has absolutely disavowed any connection to those, as has the Defense Department. The president also sending out some important words of reassurance tonight to Americans, saying that the government is still in operation, essential personnel will be back at work later on tonight, and that the government will be open for business tomorrow. And even though the stock market will be closed tomorrow, Dan, the president reassuring Americans, saying that the American economy will be open for business. The big message here tonight that the president was trying to send out was the idea that they can hit us, but they can't knock us down. He said that we have stared enemies in the face before, we have stared them down, and we will do this again. So the president, Dan, tonight, using every ounce of resolve that he can muster to say the United States will recover from this enormous tragedy. Dan?
John Roberts at the White House. Now, U.S. officials are starting to piece together the case of what happened today, and in some instances they're piecing together what they see as links to Osama bin Laden for being responsible for the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history. That Orrin Hatch, the top Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee tonight, said They, meaning intelligence operations, they have an intercept of some information that included people associated with bin Laden who acknowledged a couple of targets were hit. That's a direct quote from Senator Hatch. He went on to say that law enforcement has data possibly linking one person on one of the 4 ill-fated flights to bin Laden's organization. Now, government and industry officials say at least one flight attendant and 2 passengers called from 3 of the planes as they were being forced down in New York and Washington, each describing similar circumstances. The callers indicated the hijackers were, at least in the beginning, armed with knives. This day's horrific events began with the familiar turbine whine of jet engines over New York. But this Boeing 767 was too low and not in the regular flight pattern. It was aimed straight for the massive twin towers of the World Trade Center. It hit it. CBS's Byron Pitts is on the scene tonight. Byron?
Well, Dan, a few moments ago, a producer for 60 Minutes just walked back from the crime scene and said she counted only 4 floors left. 4 stories left of one of the 110-story towers. At this hour, rescue teams are still waiting, still hoping, still praying they will find survivors alive. Without exaggeration, Ground Zero looks like a battlefield. 8:48 a.m. Mayhem in Manhattan.
We saw a plane coming very low, and everyone said, wow, that plane is very, very low.
I was walking to work, and all of a sudden, I see a jet crash into the first tower.
An American Airlines flight loaded with 92 people crashes head-on into the North Tower of the World Trade Center.
And then we heard the crash. We ran to the window.
Into the building. It went into the Trade Center.
And we said, hit the Trade Center. We saw the shrapnel fall, and then we said, get out.
And minutes later.
There's another one. Another plane just hit. Right. Oh, my God. Another plane has just hit.
I heard a roar, and I looked around thinking that it had to be a helicopter, and I looked up, and I saw the second plane hit.
A second commercial plane, a United Airlines jet, also hijacked, carrying 65 people, plows into the South Tower.
First one we thought was an accident. When we heard there was a second one, we definitely thought it was terrorism.
On the ground, witnesses could not believe their eyes. 70 stories up with the building burning. Reason gave way to desperation. New York's bravest never had a chance.
We really never even got to that close to the building. The explosion blew and it knocked everybody over.
Less than an hour later, the South Tower came crumbling down.
It collapsed. The top floors collapsed down. I saw it blow and then ran like hell. Thank God. I'm 69, but I can still run.
But it was far from over.
Tower 2 collapsed into Tower 1. Within minutes after that, we were ordered out.
When the dust settled, signs of life started to emerge.
Chaos. It's just chaos out here. It really is. So the Twin Towers fall. It's amazing. It's crazy. I can't believe this shit is happening. I really can't. It's nightmares. Armageddon right here.
This was the worst act of terrorism on U.S. soil, but not the first attack on the World Trade Center. 8 years ago, terrorists set off bombs in the basement in an effort to take down the 2 towers. They failed. Today, mission accomplished.
I tell you what, it's a sad day for America. It really is.
By 2 o'clock this afternoon, firefighters and police officers and paramedics by the hundreds stood by, many of them feeling helpless. There was nothing they could do at this point because the building was still unsecured.
Our main priority is to get in, do a search and rescue, look for survivors, and then clean up what's left. And we can't do that until the building is deemed safe.
Ankle deep in debris and despair, rescue workers waited. Some had relatives of their own inside. One police officer told me her sister worked here on the 40th floor, due in at 9 a.m. She was always early, she said. Always. A sign on a paramedic's van spoke volumes.
We know we have some of the major brass of our department missing. We're trying to find them still.
New York Port Authority Police Chief William Hall choked back tears. For him, this was no longer just work. On a personal level, because I know that these are all your men and it's a business, but I'm sure that a lot of these guys are your friends. How you helping
It's
out?
not a business now, it's personal now.
Sir?
It's personal now. We have to get them.
Back live, we have had little relief here. Take a look at this. Hours ago, World Trade Center building number 7 collapsed, a 42-story building that crumbled hours after the initial devastation. It was the one calamity here that was not a surprise. Police had evacuated the area earlier, fearful building number 7 would indeed fall down. Minutes after the second tower collapsed, we met a firefighter named Tim McGee, a New York City firefighter. He was covered in soot from the top of his helmet to the bottom of his feet. He was crying. He told me that he had lost all of his men when the building collapsed. He asked us to reach his wife, Maria, tell her that he was okay, that he had survived. Quote, tell her, I love her. Dan.
Byron Pitts in Lower Manhattan. Mind you that the World Trade Center complex has 7 buildings. So the Twin Towers went down, they're the big ones, but then the 47-story World Trade Center building number 7 collapsed. That was near the end of Byron Pitts' report. Now, building 5 in the World Trade Center complex was for many hours today described as on the brink of collapse. The state of that building at this hour is uncertain. It was so long ago evacuated completely. Now about today's other terror strike at the seat and symbol of U.S. military might, the U.S. Defense Department, the Pentagon, first opened in 1943, never before directly attacked. There were 64 people aboard American Flight 77, the jetliner hijackers used to ram into the Pentagon. CBS's David Martin reports the deadly impact there. David?
Dan, fires are still burning, but Pentagon officials say the flames are under control and the Pentagon will be open for business tomorrow. But Defense Secretary Rumsfeld had a grim warning that casualties will be high.
Some people have been lifted out and taken away in ambulances, and the numbers will be calculated, and it will not be a few.
The first attack ever on the Pentagon occurred at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Time.
Clip this ball over here, hit another ball and slammed right into the building. Huge explosion, and then utter pandemonium, as you might imagine. I mean, everybody was screaming, oh my God.
A hijacked American Airlines jet, which had just taken off from Dulles Airport, flew right up the main highway leading north into Washington and straight into the citadel of American military power.
There was no doubt about it. It was American Airlines slammed right into the building, and there was no doubt about it. Whoever was piloting that plane was aiming for the Pentagon.
Fearful that, like the World Trade Center, a second airliner was on its way, most of the building's 23,000 workers fled.
Plane's coming in. Come on. Let's go. Come on. We're not playing around here. Let's go.
F-16 fighters circled overhead looking for a second attack, but the damage had already been done. The plane had drilled a hole about a third of the way through the world's largest office building. The wounded were rushed to nearby hospitals as the fire spread and an entire section of the building collapsed, trapping many, many more inside.
Arlington search and rescue personnel are just now, and it's about almost 2 o'clock, just now gaining access to portions of the building where the plane hit because the fires were too intense.
One ray of hope. The Pentagon is undergoing a major renovation, and some of the offices in the path of the plane were vacant.
We're trying to find out who made it out okay and account for the people that may not have made it out.
When the plane hit, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld moved from his office on the other side of the building into the National Military Command Center in the basement. With smoke hanging in the air, he ordered aircraft carriers, amphibious ships, cruisers, and destroyers to New York and Washington, where they can serve as floating hospitals, help with the cleanup, and provide air defense against the possibility of more attacks. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs made a clear threat of military retaliation.
I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
Right now, suspicion focuses on Osama bin Laden, and we have some new pictures of this damage done to the Pentagon by whoever these terrorists were. First, really close-up pictures of the damage. I'm looking at it for the first time with you. I do not see any evidence there of the fuselage of the plane. Those are corridors I've walked down thousands of times, and right now they're unrecognizable. Back to you, Dan.
David Martin reporting live again from the Pentagon. New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani has confirmed that some of the first police officers and firefighters on the scene were killed. And the mayor added that in general, quote, the number of casualties will be more than most of us can bear. Mike Carter, vice president of the Firefighters Union here in New York City, estimates that half of the 400 firefighters who first reached the scene may, I underline that word, may be dead. I quote Mike Carter of the Firefighters Union, "We have entire companies that are just missing. We lost chiefs. We're going to have to bury a lot of people," Carter said. Roman Catholic Church Cardinal Edward Egan, who administered last rites to dozens of victims, said that the firefighters and police were, quote, dead in great numbers, quote unquote, the Cardinal. Police Department and union sources, speaking on condition of anonymity, said that 78 police officers were missing. However, Assistant Chief Tom Fahey said the number of known missing among police officers is not that high. The emergency medical service worker, Luis Garcia, said initial reports indicated that bodies were buried beneath the 2 feet at least of soot on streets around the Trade Center. And Garcia said a lot of vehicles are running over bodies because bodies are all over the place. Garcia is a 15-year veteran who had 2 people die in his ambulance on the way to the hospital. That gives you some of the mood, the atmosphere, and some of the facts and eyewitness reports that surround us here in New York City tonight. Now, to punish those behind today's attacks, the U.S. must first and foremost determine who there are. There's been much speculation about that today, but so far, it's all speculation. The facts are few. Osama bin Laden, the renegade Saudi Arabian millionaire who was last reported in Afghanistan, he's widely believed to be in Afghanistan, is the most frequently mentioned suspect. But as we have before, for fairness and accuracy, it's dictated that we say nobody knows who committed these crimes today. But CBS's Jim Stewart in Washington is closely following the investigation and checking his many good sources. Jim, what can you tell us?
Dan, federal lawmen are apparently fanning out tonight to follow up on the first leads in this case. Some search warrants have been served, but officials caution it is too early to tell whether they will bear fruit. Other agents are poring over the flight manifest of the 4 doomed planes. Meanwhile, intelligence officials say they have developed what one calls significant indicators pointing to Osama bin Laden as the man behind this attack. The information suggests that the planes were hijacked by members of Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group that reports to bin Laden. Sources describe the intelligence as communications intercepts. It's not definitive, said one official, but it is persuasive. Sensing that bin Laden would quickly become a suspect, Afghanistan's ruling Taliban party, which has been giving him safe refuge, called a press conference. We do not allow Osama bin Laden to operate from our land, the Taliban said, warning the U.S. not to take any, quote, speedy actions to retaliate. Meanwhile, law enforcement sources said there had been no credible claims for the joint attacks and that intelligence had picked up no specific threats aimed at targets inside the United States before the attacks took place. Within minutes of today's attacks, officials were pointing to the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center by a group with ties to bin Laden, citing it as proof that bin Laden has never given up on his dream to destroy the symbol of America's economic power. And in recent months, analysts say bin Laden has only become more and more sophisticated in his attempts to strike at the United States. They point specifically to his simultaneous attack on 2 U.S. embassies in East Africa.
They also went directly against a U.S. destroyer, which was heavily guarded, and they did put a hole in that ship, the USS Cole. So they have a track record of conducting attacks that one would think they might not be capable of.
Late today, the U.S. intelligence community was rapidly sorting through a priority list of potential suspects within the U.S. for electronic eavesdropping, with sources saying the number may reach into the hundreds. There is also specific physical evidence that investigators are eager to examine. First are the transcripts of communications between the suicide aircraft and ground controllers, including telephone calls from passengers to the ground, and second are cockpit tape recordings of conversations in the doomed aircraft. The working theory is that the hijackers were pilots themselves and forcefully took over the controls to dive the jets straight into their targets. Dan?
Jim Stewart reporting live from Washington. One of the few things that seems certain tonight is that the hijackings and attacks were meticulously planned and carried out with great precision. There's also a school of thought that says this kind of operation required a lot of financial resources. And there is a school of thought among intelligence operatives at high levels in this country and abroad that Osama bin Laden, despite the fact that he is a multimillionaire, that even bin Laden requires additional financial support from somewhere to carry out this kind of operation. Now, some of the speculation is supported by very few facts, if any. However, this thing being carried out with great precision is consistent with the hard facts. Somebody planned this thing exceptionally well. Correspondent Bob Orr, who covers aviation for CBS News, has pieced a lot of this together. Bob?
Well, Dan, it clearly was a highly coordinated attack this morning, launched with simultaneous breaches of security at 3 of the nation's busiest airports. Under the cover of the hectic morning rush, when airports are particularly vulnerable, hijackers managed to board 4 large passenger jets, 2 each from American Airlines and United Airlines, 2 of the strongest symbols of U.S. aviation. American Flight 11, a Boeing 767, took off first at 7:45 this morning from Boston, bound for Los Angeles. 13 minutes later, another 767, United Flight 175, also left Boston for L.A. At virtually the same moment, United Flight 93, a 757, took off from Newark for San Francisco. And to the south at Washington's Dulles Airport, another 757, American Flight 77, flew off towards Los Angeles. The first sign that anything was wrong was noticed by air traffic controllers, who watched the jets stray from their planned routes. This computerized radar path shows how the first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, climbed out of Boston and, as expected, headed northwest across Massachusetts. But watch what happened. As the plane entered eastern New York, it turned sharply to the south and headed straight for Manhattan. The 767 hit the World Trade Center at 8:48 this morning. And 16 minutes later, United Flight 175 delivered the second blow. The jets, fueled for cross-country flights, were filled with tens of thousands of gallons of volatile fuel. They were literally flying bombs, each with an explosive power far greater than the blast that leveled the Oklahoma City Federal Building. Based on radio communications from the planes, FAA authorities knew they were dealing with a terrorist attack and immediately moved to close New York and Washington airports. And for the first time in U.S. history, all flights across the country were grounded.
The airport's being evacuated. They need to go home.
But there were still 2 hijacked jets in the air, and one of them, American Airlines Flight 77, took aim on the Pentagon. It crashed in a fireball at 9:38. Meanwhile, the 4th plane, the flight from Newark to San Francisco, was heading west, and it traveled all the way into northeastern Ohio. The controllers monitoring radar watched as the jet then did a U-turn and headed back towards the East Coast. At 10:20, 2.5 hours after the 4-pronged attack was launched, the plane crashed in a rural Pennsylvania field.
I happened to hear a plane come through. It sounded like it was running normally. When it come down over top of me, I seen it go nosedive straight into the ground down here. Everything was running fine on the plane, it sounded like.
Authorities say 285 people died aboard the airliners today, and tonight the FAA is at a loss to explain how the security failures happened. There is some new information that in at least 2 of the attacks, the hijackers may have used knives, and those are harder than guns for security officials to detect. But most importantly, remember this. These were suicide attacks, long known to be the very hardest to stop. There's no piece of equipment and no screener that absolutely can stop a terrorist who is willing to die. Dan?
Live in Washington, Bob Orr. There they were, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, soaring symbols of American power and wealth. And in just minutes, there they weren't, reduced to rubble by faceless enemies. The world's most famous skyline changed forever by a horrendous, cowardly act of terror. CBS's Richard Schlesinger has more about the impact of an image that will last forever.
Right there's another one. It is difficult to overestimate the power of these images.
Oh, my God.
It's difficult to put into words what today's attacks have done to the nation. Calamities almost unparalleled in the country's history.
Pearl Harbor is one of the first things that comes to mind.
Evan Cornog is a historian and journalist at Columbia University. As the attack unfolded live before our eyes, it was hard not to be reminded of the most recent large-scale sneak attack, almost 60 years ago.
A date which will live in infamy.
After Pearl Harbor, there was the Japanese fleet to go after. One knew where to find the enemy. Here, it's a much more complicated issue.
Just as the U.S. Navy was a symbol of our power then, the Pentagon and the World Trade Center were symbols of our power now, our place in the world.
Those towers are saying, look at us, we're important. And somebody has come along and said, you're not as important as you think.
We are certainly not as invulnerable as we may have thought. For years, authorities have practiced for terrorist attacks, many times under the direction of Jerome Hauer, a former emergency management official in New York.
You have to plan for the worst. That's just, particularly in a city like in New York, in Washington, D.C., the real thing is never like a drill. The enormity of the situation today is just, is just incredible.
The symbolism of the attack was impossible to ignore overseas.
The feeling is that throughout the world, the Americans are not as powerful as they were thought to be. Therefore, these terrorists were really going to achieve a symbolic victory.
But officials here in New York and in Washington know the difference between a symbolic victory and a real victory. When the World Trade Center was brought to the ground, the country was brought to its knees. But terrorism experts say just for a while.
Did the bad guys win today? They got that image. They got, well, they certainly just struck a blow today. There's no question about it. We are a very resilient nation, and we are very resilient people.
And we're a very different people than we were just before 9 o'clock this morning when this all began. Richard Schlesinger, CBS News, New York.
During this hour, President Bush said that the terror attacks today took, quote, thousands of lives. The search goes on tonight in the rubble of the World Trade Center towers struck this morning by two hijacked commercial jetliners, the worst terror attack ever on U.S. soil. President Bush vowed to find and punish those responsible. CBS News coverage of the attack on America will continue in a moment. Back now at CBS News World Headquarters in New York, our live continuing coverage of the events of this horrible, historic day. Let's talk now about terrorism and about those who see violence against innocent civilians as a legitimate means, in their view, to achieve their ends. Judith Miller is a veteran reporter from the New York Times, an expert on the Middle East in general, widely traveled in the region, and an expert on Osama bin Laden in particular. Judith Miller, thank you for being with us. Preliminary evidence, we are told, points at bin Laden's networks. What is that evidence? Well, unfortunately, we've had some sort of foul-up here, and we hope to get to the interview with Judith Miller shortly. In the meantime, let's go to Lower Manhattan and Scott Pelley.
Dan, there are estimates being released tonight by the New York City Firefighters Union of as many as 200 firefighters killed today. The New York City Police Union says there may be as many as 87 police officers who are missing. Those are estimates, of course. The numbers will change, but it does give you a sense of the magnitude of what has been happening here. We spent virtually the entire day near the seat of the disaster with those who were called upon to risk their lives to save others. On some of the highest floors, the inferno and the smoke fueled a panic that led some to the windows, where they were either blown out or chose to fall.
I've seen at least 12 people either jump or they had no choice. I don't know if it was by force. They didn't want to get burned or they didn't want to blow up, but they just jumped. And just look at them flying out the buildings like they're paper.
For New Yorkers who witnessed the catastrophe, there was no doubt for an instant that it was terrorism.
It was too nice a day for that to be an accident. We're just talking amongst ourselves.
You knew the plane hadn't gotten lost?
Not a day like today, first thing. It's a beautiful day. How does a plane hit a building on a beautiful day like that?
Firefighters working at the center of the attack describe a scene of overwhelming devastation. Pieces of bodies in the streets and in the rubble.
Rescuers climbed the girders of the shattered building searching for any sign of life, but there were precious few. Many firefighters and officers were wounded or killed when the first responders were caught in the collapse of the towers. One police officer told us no one has ever seen anything like this unless they were in Dresden in World War II.
Horrible, horrible. The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
1 block from the base of the World Trade Center tower, the inferno burned 4 hours after the attack. Police cars, the first to respond, were incinerated by the collapse of the second tower. Many firefighters and officers were wounded in the collapse, perhaps killed. No one can say how many.
No idea how many people, cops are dead. We have many people hurt.
What about the casualties? What have you seen?
Uncountable. Let's go.
Courageous firefighters responded from all over New York City, called from off-duty, called from vacation. Renee Davila was the first EMS supervisor at the scene.
I was there, and I saw the building collapse. We all started running. And I ended up inside the Hilton somewhere. I was like trapped. I don't know where I was. I couldn't find my way out with all the smoke and the debris in there. I finally just closed the door behind me and covered it so no more smoke and debris would come in. And what I did was I called my wife. I told her I love her.
Go gas another one. Hours after the attack, many smaller explosions rumbled through downtown. Firemen, paramedics, and police officers walked out of the carnage in shock and disbelief.
It was unbelievable in there. This guy's still trapped. We couldn't get to him.
Anybody want to volunteer?
Many New Yorkers rushed downtown to volunteer. These construction workers were from Iron Workers Local 40. What's the job in there?
Whatever it is, to save somebody, one person saved is a life saved.
Through the day, an inferno raged in World Trade Center Building Number 7, another massive office tower. Firefighters feared that it would collapse, and a little more than 8 hours after the attack, the abandoned building fell. 47 stories in the street. This is what's left of the carefully organized files and lives that were the World Trade Center. Bits of paper blasted into the street, construction dust 1 inch or 2 inches deep everywhere you look. What's eerie about this place now, several hours after the initial disaster, is just how quiet it is. You don't hear any ambulances racing away from the World Trade Center anymore.
I saw many injuries.
Hundreds, thousands.
My eyesight did not see hundreds and thousands. I know that my heart and my brain tells me they were hundreds.
We spoke to some firefighters earlier today near the scene of the World Trade Center towers. They told us that they were under the towers when they began to fall, and as they looked up and saw the buildings coming down on top of them, they glanced over their shoulders and saw the entrance to a subway station. They threw themselves down the stairs of the subway. The building collapsed. These firefighters told us they dug themselves out of the subway and went back to work. We talked to those firefighters at the base of World Trade Center Building Number 7. We left them there 1 hour before that building collapsed. We don't know whether they escaped a second time. Dan?
Scott Pelley, we know that building number 5 in the World Trade Center complex had the 2 twin towers. They're gone. Building number 7 is gone. But building number 5 was reported hours ago as teetering on the brink of collapse. Any late word on that building, which in most cities would be the tallest building in town?
Dan, that building was thoroughly involved in fire when we were down there a couple of hours ago. Firefighters have been virtually helpless to try to drive these fires back because of the magnitude of what is happening, the glass that is continually falling on top of them in the street. We don't know the disposition of World Trade Center Building Number 5 at this hour, but much of it was blown away. It is difficult to imagine
how it could ever survive. It will probably have to be raised at some point.
Scott Pelley live on the lower tip of Manhattan. There are indications that many, many people were literally buried alive in the collapse of the buildings today. Some people are still believed to be alive in the rubble, but rescue workers, firefighters, police, and others for a long period of time could not get anywhere near them to determine how many people might still be alive. As of about 7 o'clock New York time tonight, rescue workers were beginning to go into the very heart of the destruction, and by, say, dawn tomorrow, perhaps before, we'll have some reports on whether they found anybody alive in the rubble. Now, we want to give you a moment-by-moment look at how the attack on America unfolded, and correspondent Russ Mitchell gives us that.
It's early this Tuesday morning, the 11th of September, 2001.
It began as a shimmering late summer day.
WCBS News Time, 8:48. It's traffic and weather together. Tom Kaminsky, Chopper 880.
All right, Pat, we are just currently getting a look at the World Trade Center. We have something that has happened here at the World Trade Center.
And within half an hour, became America's second Pearl Harbor.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.
By now, you've seen the pictures. But it's been a long, agonizing, and confusing 12 hours.
Oh, it was chaos. It's something out of a movie.
So, briefly, here's what we know about exactly what happened. 8:48 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, hijacked en route from Boston to Los Angeles, slams into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, 2/3 of the way up the 110-story building.
We had seen a fireball, and I can tell you it appears as though something has gone into the World Trade Center.
20 minutes later, at 9:08 a.m., a United Airlines flight, number 175, also from Boston to Los Angeles, tips its wings and crashes into the South Tower.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
An incredible fireball, so remarkable, it didn't even seem real.
Looked like a plane rammed into the second building.
35 minutes after that, 9:43 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77, scheduled to fly to Los Angeles from Dulles Airport outside Washington, dives into the Pentagon, destroying one of the building's 5 sides.
I happened to hear a plane come through. It sounded like it was running normal.
10:10 a.m., the 4th hijacked plane, United 93 from Newark to San Francisco, crashes in a remote area 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh.
It just come down like it was going to land, but instead of landing, it just went nose straight into the ground.
In a little more than an hour, 4 horrific plane crashes, hundreds believed dead. But far worse was yet to come. At 10:05 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center, possibly weakened beyond hope by the plane's impact, collapses. People can be seen jumping from the high floors.
The building came just rumbling down. It was like a war zone.
10:28 a.m., and the North Tower, choked with smoke and flames from its upper floors, disintegrates. Smoke and ash from the destruction combined to make parts of New York City look like ancient Pompeii after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Rescue firemen were coated with thick white dust.
This is terrible. We lost tons of guys. We lost tons of guys.
Cars were under blankets of ash. Rescuers were just happy to be alive. As for the death toll, even tonight there were no hard numbers. But New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani feared it might extend into the thousands. Half a world away, there was a far different reaction. Gunmen appearing to applaud today's terrorism. But Palestine Liberation Organization leader Yasser Arafat did not join in.
We are completely shocked. Completely shocked.
In Afghanistan, a spokesman for the ruling Taliban, who provides sanctuary for terrorist leader Osama bin Laden, said he could not have been behind the attack.
Everybody out! Everybody out!
Back home, it was as if war had been declared.
Ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families.
President Bush spoke to the nation, first briefly in Florida, and later from a military base in Louisiana.
The resolve of our great nation is being tested. But make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
Then, heading to another military base outside Omaha.
The airport's being evacuated. They need to go home.
All international flights into the U.S. were diverted to Canada. The FAA stopped every single commercial airplane flight for the first time ever. And terrorism experts made it a point to remind everyone that tomorrow had been set as a sentencing date for an associate of Osama bin Laden for his role in the 1988 bombing of the American embassy in Tanzania. That sentencing had been set for a federal courthouse near the World Trade Center. As the day ended in New York City, another skyscraper in the World Trade Center complex crumbled. Building number 7, 47 stories high. And tonight, while smoke from the collapse of the Twin Towers still lingered over New York City, most who saw and survived this day still had trouble believing what they saw. The phrase you heard over and over again was, "It seemed just like a movie."
Rush Mitchell. In Washington, the nerve center of the U.S. military sustained its own swift attack. David Martin, our national security correspondent, has details about what happened at the Pentagon and how the U.S. military might retaliate when retaliation is deemed appropriate. David?
Dan, 12 hours after the attack, fires are still burning, although Pentagon officials say the flames are under control and the Pentagon will be open for business tomorrow. We now have new close-up pictures of the damage done by that plane, and Defense Secretary Rumsfeld had a grim warning that casualties will be high.
Some people have been lifted out and taken away in ambulances, and the numbers will be calculated, and it will not be a few.
The first attack ever on the Pentagon occurred at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Time.
Flipped this pole over here, hit another pole and slammed right into the building. Huge explosion, and then utter pandemonium, as you might imagine. I mean, everybody was screaming, "Oh my God."
A hijacked American Airlines jet, which had just taken off from Dulles Airport, flew right up the main highway leading north into Washington and straight into the citadel of American military power.
There was no doubt about it. It was American Airlines slammed right into the building, and there was no doubt about it. Whoever was piloting that plane was aiming for the Pentagon.
Fearful that, like the World Trade Center, a second airliner was on its way, most of the building's 23,000 workers fled.
Plane's coming in. Come on. Let's go. Let's go. Come on. We're not playing around here. Let's go.
F-16 fighters circled overhead looking for a second attack, but the damage had already been done. The plane had drilled a hole about a third of the way through the world's largest office building. The wounded were rushed to nearby hospitals as the fire spread and an entire section of the building collapsed, trapping many, many more inside. Arlington search and rescue personnel are just now, and it's about almost 2 o'clock, just now gaining access to portions of the building where the plane hit because the fires were too intense. One ray of hope. The Pentagon is undergoing a major renovation, and some of the offices in the path of the plane were vacant.
We're trying to find out who made it out okay and account for the people that may not have made it out.
When the plane hit, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld moved from his office on the other side of the building into the National Military Command Center in the basement. With smoke hanging in the air, he ordered aircraft carriers, amphibious ships, cruisers, and destroyers to New York and Washington, where they can serve as floating hospitals, help with the cleanup, and provide air defense against the possibility of more attacks. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs made a clear threat of military retaliation.
I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
Right now, suspicion focuses on Osama bin Laden, but first things first. The FBI is combing the wreckage for evidence, and all U.S. military bases and embassies are at the highest state of alert. Dan?
David Martin reporting again live from the Pentagon. President Bush today called it, quote, a national tragedy, and the president vowed to, quote, hunt down and punish those responsible for the attacks. And there are already indications of who, or at least some of the who may have been behind them. More on that, we turn to Jim Stewart in Washington. Jim?
Dan, it didn't take long, and it's unclear whether it will lead to anything, but federal investigators are on the move tonight, serving search warrants and questioning potential accomplices to these attacks. Sources say the first concrete tips were picked up from a study of the flight manifest aboard the doomed aircraft. At least one search, we're being told, is in the Miami area. Meanwhile, intelligence officials say they have now picked up what one official calls significant indicators that the suicide planes were hijacked by members of Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group that reports to Osama bin Laden. Sources described the intelligence as communications intercepts and said they're not definitive, but they are persuasive. Sensing that bin Laden would quickly become a suspect, Afghanistan's ruling Taliban party, which has been giving him safe refuge, called a press conference. We do not allow Osama bin Laden to operate from our land, the Taliban said, warning the U.S. not to take any, quote, speedy actions to retaliate. Slowly, FBI evidence teams are starting to piece together what happened on the aircraft and zeroing in on how the terrorists pulled off the hijackings. Attorney General John Ashcroft provided one insight when he said that the hijackers of one of the aircraft had apparently sneaked knives through airport security.
American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston for Los Angeles, hijacked by suspects armed with knives. This plane crashed into the World Trade Center.
Within minutes of today's attacks, officials were pointing to the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center by a group with ties to bin Laden, citing it as proof that bin Laden has never given up on his dream to destroy the symbol of America's economic power. And in recent months, analysts say bin Laden has only become more and more sophisticated in his attempts to strike at the United States. They point specifically to his simultaneous attack on 2 U.S. embassies in East Africa.
They also went directly against a U.S. destroyer, which was heavily guarded, and they did put a hole in that ship, the USS Cole. So they have a track record of conducting attacks that one would think they might not be capable of.
Late today, the U.S. intelligence community was rapidly sorting through a priority list of potential suspects within the U.S. for electronic eavesdropping, with sources saying the number may reach into the hundreds. Some of the very doomed passengers themselves may have provided authorities with their first valuable tips. In panic desperation, some of the passengers, including, we're told, the wife of U.S. Solicitor General Ted Olson, called from a cell phone to say their plane had been hijacked. Another passenger called from the restroom at the rear of another aircraft. One passenger, it has been suggested, provided detailed information about one of the hijackers. The working theory by lawmen so far is that the hijackers were pilots themselves and forcefully took over the controls to dive their jets straight into the targets. Dan.
Jim Stewart, live in our Washington Bureau. Join us now again for perspective and context on this. Former U.S. National Security Advisor Sandy Berger, who was in fact the National Security Advisor for 8 years straight through. Sandy Berger, question. There was a time, my recollection, in the 1980s, possibly the late 1970s, when the United States put aboard aircraft skyjack protection specialists in civilian clothes. Now that was ended. Was any thought given while you were the National Security Advisor to reinstituting that for protection aboard airliners?
Not as far as I know. We had, as you remember, Dan, a spate of hijackings during the 70s and 80s. The United States intensified its airport security and essentially has had a grip on that problem for the past 10 years. We've had very little of this activity.
Past tense now.
And one of the things that is so staggering about today is that in 4 separate instances, people were able to get aboard planes and circumvent the security system that has worked so well for 10 years.
Sandy Berger, you said it earlier, and I want to emphasize it again now. Our main focus tonight is on those people dead, missing, wounded, and their families. But as a former National Security Council advisor until very recently, and one of our ranking experts, I want to expand this conversation out. There's a lot of talk now of we will retaliate. And Senator Orrin Hatch said tonight, well, our intelligence operatives have some indications that there are links to Osama bin Laden. There's talk about, well, the Taliban in Afghanistan better dig deeper, in effect, because if it turns out Osama bin Laden did it, the Taliban's been protecting him, hiding him within their country, then he better look out. But talk to us realistically about the whole subcontinent. Both Pakistan and India are nuclear powers now. Pakistan right on the border with Afghanistan. All of this by way of saying, if it's ever decided that Osama bin Laden was responsible for this and he's still in Afghanistan, there are no easy answers about how to get him, how to retaliate.
Well, I think that's an important point, Dan. Of course, let me repeat your caveat. We don't know. America proceeds on facts, not on speculation. So, number one, we have to determine what has happened here. But we're talking, if we are talking about bin Laden, about a very difficult target. This is far from nowhere, in very rough terrain. And I don't believe this is now, given the escalation that we've seen today of monumental proportions, susceptible of being dealt with in one pop, in one sort of exquisite act. This may require the administration to look at a range of options, from economic pressure to military options that go beyond simply missiles from afar.
Very quickly, Sandy Berger, because we don't have much time left in this particular segment. Can we or can we not absolutely count on the government, now a new government in Pakistan, to help with this new problem?
Well, the government of Pakistan has been cooperative in some respects on terrorism. They have turned over several operatives of bin Laden, but you also have to understand that the ties between the Pakistani intelligence and military and the Taliban and bin Laden's operations are quite intermingled. And the extent to which the Pakistanis will cooperate, I think if we needed that cooperation, remains to be seen.
Fair to say, open to questions. Sandy Berger, yes. Thank you very much again for being with us. Now, one question at the very heart of today's attacks is how, with so much security, alleged and otherwise, at America's airports, how did these hijackings happen? Bob Orr has been looking for some answers. Bob?
Well, Dan, there's some evidence tonight that the hijackers of at least 2 of the 4 jetliners involved in today's attack used knives to overpower flight attendants and then take control of the cockpits. It obviously was all part of a highly coordinated strike with simultaneous breaches of security at 3 of the nation's busiest airports during the hectic morning rush hour. And the jets targeted belonged to American Airlines and United Airlines, 2 of the most powerful symbols of U.S. aviation.
American Flight 11, a Boeing 767, took off first at 7:45 this morning from Boston, bound for Los Angeles. 13 minutes later, another 767, United Flight 175, also left Boston for L.A. At virtually the same moment, United Flight 93, a 757, took off from Newark for San Francisco. And to the south at Washington's Dulles Airport, another 757, American Flight 77, flew off towards Los Angeles. The first sign that anything was wrong was noticed by air traffic controllers, who watched the jets stray from their planned routes. This computerized radar path shows how the first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, climbed out of Boston and, as expected, headed northwest across Massachusetts. But watch what happened. As the plane entered eastern New York, it turned sharply to the south and headed straight for Manhattan. The 767 hit the World Trade Center at 8:48 this morning. And 16 minutes later, United Flight 175 delivered the second blow. The jets, fueled for cross-country flights, were filled with tens of thousands of gallons of volatile fuel. They were literally flying bombs, each with an explosive power far greater than the blast that leveled the Oklahoma City Federal Building. Based on radio communications from the planes, FAA authorities knew they were dealing with a terrorist attack and immediately moved to close New York and Washington airports. And for the first time in U.S. history, all flights across the country were grounded.
The airport's being evacuated. They need to go home.
But there were still 2 hijacked jets in the air, and one of them, American Airlines Flight 77, took aim on the Pentagon. It crashed in a fireball at 9:38. Meanwhile, the 4th plane, the flight from Newark to San Francisco, was heading west, and it traveled all the way into northeastern Ohio. The controllers monitoring radar watched as the jet then did a U-turn and headed back towards the East Coast. At 10:20, 2.5 hours after the 4-pronged attack was launched, the plane crashed in a rural Pennsylvania field.
I happened to hear the plane come through. It sounded like it was running normally. When it come down over top of me, I seen it go nosedive straight into the ground down here. Everything was running fine on the plane, it sounded like.
Authorities now say tonight 285 people, it seems, died aboard the airliners. And tonight, all flights remain grounded all across the country. Now, the FAA officials say they may reopen the national airspace tomorrow afternoon, but then again, they may not. In any case, when the flights do resume, we're told we'll see an unprecedented level of security for U.S. aviation. But even then, it will not be an aviation system that's very well equipped to prevent suicide attacks. Dan?
Bob Orr live in Washington. 285 now, the number of people aboard the hijacked planes and presumed dead. Dateline Tokyo, stocks in Tokyo plunged early Wednesday morning. Traders dumped shares, at least partially, if not mostly, in reaction to the terrorist attacks. And Dateline New York City at this hour, a story that will make your spine tingle and the hair raise up on the back of your neck. Authorities say a Munhall, Pennsylvania woman called 911 shortly before 8 p.m. tonight, New York time, saying her brother was, quote, still trapped under 40 feet of rubble near the Forward Hotel in Manhattan. That's in the area where the World Trade Center's buildings collapsed. The 911 coordinator says the victim told his sister he was still trapped under the World Trade Center wreckage. He gave specific directions to where he was located and said he was there with 2 New York City police sergeants and was calling for help. They declined to release the name of the woman, and authorities in New York said they are aware of this report of survivors. Can they get to them in the rubble where they are buried? And if so, can they get to them soon enough? A reminder, you are watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America. Now, we'll be back after a little bit. We give you that break for our stations up and down the line, and we'll give another break shortly on. During this minute, let us say to you that we know that there are 285 people aboard the hijacked planes. The belief is they are dead. The numbers of dead in the World Trade Center disaster area, unknown, and it may be unknown for days, although Mayor Rudolph Giuliani has said from mid-morning that we should be prepared for very large casualties. A union firefighters official said that perhaps as many as 200 firefighters may be dead, because many of them rushed to the scene immediately when the first plane cracked into the first World Trade Center building. And, well, his speculation was that as many as 200 may be dead. Unquestionably, some New York police and firefighters have lost their lives. We know not how many. At last report, dozens of New York City police officers were missing. Now, again, a reminder for our stations, you're watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America. Back now at CBS News World Headquarters in New York. CBS's special coverage of the attack on America continues, as it will throughout the evening and early morning and into tomorrow. The headlines at this hour. Addressing the nation from the White House tonight, President Bush said thousands of lives were suddenly ended, unquote, in the multiple terror attacks in New York City, the nation's capital, and Pennsylvania, and the Pentagon included on that list. President Bush said bluntly, the United States will not distinguish between the terrorists who actually committed the acts and what he called those who harbor them. He did not indicate that he knows or anybody knows who committed the attacks, or for that matter, who harbored them. Here in New York City, the desperate search for victims runs on into the night. At the site where 2 hijacked commercial U.S. jetliners were used to ram the twin towers of the World Trade Center. Both towers, where approximately 50,000 people work on the average day, collapsed. A third building in the tower complex, a 47-story building, collapsed there later in the day. President Bush says the death toll is in the thousands. A third hijacked jetliner crashed into the Pentagon, and a fourth hijacked jetliner, possibly being diverted to the Washington area, came down in southwestern Pennsylvania, about 80 miles from Pittsburgh. All told, 285 is the revised upward number of dead on the hijacked planes alone. The FAA has ordered an unprecedented shutdown of air traffic nationwide at least through noon tomorrow. The U.S. military is on worldwide alert. The nation's capital was stunned by the attacks. Government offices were closed and evacuated, but there is every effort being made to show now that the government is still up and running, as Bob Schieffer reports to us now. Bob?
Well, Dan, like the other public buildings here in Washington, the Capitol was shut down today, the workers were sent home, and the congressional leaders, in a security measure that has never been used before, were helicoptered away to a secure location. But tonight, in an incredible show of bipartisan resolve, hundreds of members of Congress gathered on the steps of the Capitol to say these acts of terrorism will not stand, the government will continue to operate, and Congress will continue to function, and that the two parties will come together to support the president.
When American suffers, and when people perpetrate acts against this country, we as a Congress and as a government stand united, and we stand together.
We will speak with one voice to condemn these attacks, to comfort the victims and their families, to commit our full support to the effort to bring those responsible to justice.
It was a kind of thing seldom seen here, and in a touching close, they literally sang the praises of their country.
God bless America, my home, sweet home.
A very different scene than we saw at the Congress and at the Capitol last week. Tonight, Dan, all those arguments about who lost the surplus didn't seem very important anymore. This is a Congress now that is going to settle down to business. I think tomorrow you'll see them back in session, passing a very strong resolution of support of the president, determined to find who caused this and to see that there is appropriate punishment. Dan.
Bob Schieffer reporting live from Washington with the White House in the background. Here tonight with his analysis and to help give us some context and perspective is the former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, a former Assistant Secretary of State of the United States of America, and one of the United States' most experienced diplomats, both in Asia, Europe, and other places abroad, including Africa, Richard Holbrooke. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for being with us. You've thought about this today. What are the most important things for Americans to have in mind as we steady ourselves and prepare for the long trail back from this day of infamy?
Well, after we get through recognizing the first fundamental thing, which is this terrible loss of life here in New York among policemen and firemen and citizens, and rallying, as so many people have said today, I think we have to look to the future. And on that point, Dan, let me emphasize the most important sentence in President Bush's speech, when he said, we will make no distinction between those who committed the act and those who harbor those who committed it. That is the beginning of an essential change in the rules. Let us say, for sake of argument, that it was Osama bin Laden, as everyone thinks, although there's no proof at this point. If it was Osama bin Laden, then the Taliban, who have harbored him, must be regarded as equally responsible for what can only be described as an act of war against the mainland of the United States. And I think there will be consequences. Point number two, in order for those consequences to be successful, to strike at the heart of the people who did this, we will need allies. We will need our NATO allies. We will need the Russians and the Chinese to play their part. Each country has played games in the past, as you well know and as you've reported many times. And you yourself have been in Afghanistan, so you have a unique understanding of what the situation on the ground there is like. And in addition, we will need the support of moderate Arab countries like Egypt and Jordan and others, who are going to have to abandon any pan-Arab solidarity in favor of demonstrating that they will not tolerate an act of war in the United States.
Richard Holbrooke, you know the history better than I. That great powers have made efforts to militarily move in Afghanistan. Great Britain in the 19th century, the Soviet Union in the 20th century. Is it or is it not a nightmare scenario that we get unimpeachable evidence that Osama bin Laden was connected to this, and unimpeachable evidence is in Afghanistan, to take on Afghanistan, to talk about retaliation in that terrible, in many ways, nightmarish place? I mean, what can one say about that?
It is a nightmare scenario, and it's going to be incredibly difficult. But there's something else that all Americans must remember tonight if we talk about history, and the rest of the world should remember too, and that when America's resolve is there, when Americans are united, as we were on December 7th, 1941, after Pearl Harbor, And this is certainly comparable to Pearl Harbor, and the death toll is going to be much higher, I'm afraid, than the 2,000 sailors and seamen who died at Pearl Harbor. When the United States is united, and when we rally international support behind us, we have always prevailed, and I have no doubt we will prevail here. But there will be consequences. The world is going to change, from small things like changes in airport security, which are going to inconvenience all Americans, to big things like our mindset and our international leadership. This will not be a day like others. The world will change because of what has happened today, after we dig through the debris and save the people who are still fighting for their lives in Lower Manhattan.
Richard Hopwood, thank you. As the scope of this tragedy widened, the Red Cross today issued repeated pleas for volunteers and blood donors. As you may know, there's a shortage of blood plasma practically all over the world and in most places in the United States, and that includes New York City. Aaron Moriarty reports now on how New York City, in terms of this need for blood, literally rolled up its sleeve.
Don't worry. Come on, where's your... Over here.
I turned on the TV, and it was a horror show. It's like World War III.
I keep on telling people that I think I'm going to wake up and it's going to be a bad dream. It's going to be a bad dream. And, you know, when you think about all the things that have gone on in our lives, this could be the worst.
The first thing came to my mind is this is work. You know, it's obviously an act of aggression. It's obviously very well organized.
I see a plane falling from the sky. Right? Yeah! All of a sudden you hear explosion, and then you could see the building starting to collapse, and then everybody runs up the street.
The still billowing smoke is a reminder of just how profoundly changed this city is today. Schools, offices, and stores are all closed. There's no traffic or noise anywhere, not even here on Fifth Avenue. But if the city seems very different today, so do the people who live here.
The people who are here for the blood drive are to stay in their seats in the lobby.
New Yorkers didn't mind getting in long lines today or giving something away, their blood.
I work right down the block, and this is the best thing that we could do to help people out. You know, with tragedy, my brother's a fireman, he's down there. So at this point, I think Americans can just get together and, with this such a tragic situation, what else can you do but maybe hopefully save somebody's life by giving blood?
Why are you here? Del Zeidman came when she realized she couldn't do anything else to help a friend.
A friend of mine worked in the World Trade Center, and that's why I'm here, because it's personal.
Elizabeth Whelan and her daughter Christine feared they lost a husband and a father.
My husband works in the World Trade Center, and into World Trade Center, and this morning, because he was going to vote, he decided to jog before he went to work. So on my way to work, I saw him jogging outside my office here at 68th and Broadway. So when I got up and heard the news, I knew that he was safe. But my daughter, who lived...
I had no idea. I was watching television as the second plane went into World Trade Center. And it was 9 in the morning, so I thought my father was at work. I was frantically calling, hearing his voice on voicemail. And I had no idea whether he was alive or dead.
Still a little in shock, they are feeling very, very lucky.
We were standing there hugging each other, watching those buildings go down from our apartment building, and it was just the most terrifying thing because he could have been there, he should have been there. It was just a minor miracle he wasn't.
No one knows exactly how much blood will be needed. Linda Levi of the New York Blood Center.
So our inventory was actually pretty good this week.
When you say that, how many days under normal circumstances?
We typically like to have at least 5 days of every blood type available, and with that we have a comfortable blood inventory. But an emergency that happened today, that could be gone in a day or even less.
When the second explosion occurred, everything went dark. Despite the confusion, despite a wait that often stretched for hours,
I'd like to volunteer for the American Red Cross.
there were no complaining New Yorkers. The only harsh words were for those behind the terrorist acts.
they've declared war on the United States.
Because they've got a nation of 300 million people that are very, very angry at whoever wants to step up and take credit.
It may take weeks for the full impact of today's tragedy to sink in.
My husband is sitting there contemplating that he has no law practice, that for 30 years he's been going to an office that doesn't exist anymore. And I don't know how he's going to cope with it. I don't know how anyone can cope. I can't believe it.
Let's pray. Lord our God, you are always faithful and quick to show mercy. Our brothers and sisters were suddenly and violently taken from us.
Which explains one other popular place today, St. Patrick's Cathedral. So many people went to the centers to donate blood that in some places the wait was 7 hours long, and for that reason the New York Blood Center is now asking only people with type O blood, either positive or negative, to go tomorrow. The rest of us should wait. And if you're interested in donating blood nationally, there is a toll-free number to call to get information. That number is 1-888-US-BLOOD. Dan?
Aaron, one thing that comes through in that report, and it's worth noting, New Yorkers, around this country, and for that matter around the world, have this reputation of being sort of chaotic all the time. But you and I know, as longtime residents of this city, that when the heat's on, when the pressure's on, New Yorkers are frequently at their best. And that was the case today, I think. That New Yorkers are, it's true, they're hard to herd, but they're impossible to stampede. And they didn't today. When the call went out for that blood, calmly people went to the blood centers. Aaron Moriarty, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Government and industry officials said at least one flight attendant and 2 passengers called from 3 of the planes as they were being forced down in New York and Washington today, each describing similar circumstances, and a picture is beginning to form. Bloodbath aboard some of those planes, with hijackers with knives attacking flight attendants. The callers indicated the hijackers armed with knives in some cases were stabbing flight attendants. And a businessman, his wife, and young child aboard a United flight that left Boston and crashed into the World Trade Center. Twice, this businessman called his father in Connecticut as his plane was being hijacked. This is according to law enforcement officials. Now, the law enforcement official said the victim aboard the plane's father told the FBI his son made 2 calls. Both times the phone was cut off. In the first call, the businessman said a stewardess had been stabbed. In the second call, the son said his plane was going down. Now, there was another report on another aircraft that a flight attendant aboard the second jetliner that struck the World Trade Center managed to call an emergency number from the back of the plane, and an American Airlines source said that the flight attendant reported her fellow flight attendants had been stabbed. This is information we didn't have earlier, and pictures begin to form of what the terror was in the skies. 2 of the flights involved in today's attacks began in Boston. Wyatt Andrews has more on how that city has been struck by this tragedy. Wyatt?
No, but I think we lose Kenny Hot Roll. Yeah, I wouldn't do that tonight.
At Boston's Logan Airport, where 2 of the hijacked planes originated, scores of relatives of the victims were met by airline officials for consolation and were then taken to a nearby hotel to await information. American Airlines lost its Los Angeles-bound Flight 11, and the airline confirmed the identity of its lost pilot, Captain John Oganowski, who was 52 and a 22-year veteran of the airline. Outside his home in Dracut, Massachusetts, the captain's extended family gathered, including his wife and 3 daughters. Oganowski's brother Jim described him as a hero, a man who joined the Air Force out of patriotism during the Vietnam War and who viewed his work as an airline pilot his life's dream.
Our family is obviously grieving, as is the whole nation, for what has happened today. I personally, I think I'm in shock. I'm in some type of denial.
Official information about how the flights were seized and how Logan's security might have been breached is still under investigation and is closely held. Airport officials stress that security inside Logan's terminals, as elsewhere across America, is the responsibility of the separate airlines, and that the airport itself was secure.
We've closed the airport to all arriving and all departing flights. We've increased our security measures. We've shut down all the construction sites within Logan Airport, both airside and landside.
At the Ogonowski home, official information is also apparently scarce. The pilot's brother Jim told reporters that the family had no information about what Captain Ogonowski went through or whether there were any communications between the pilot and FAA controllers. Wyatt Andrews, CBS News, Dracut, Massachusetts.
President Bush was in Florida when the attacks occurred. Florida has as its governor the president's brother, and Jeb Bush, the governor, is up for re-election. However, the president's trip to Florida today had to do with some school visitations and emphasizing his plans for education. But he quickly broke off that as soon as he learned about the attacks on the World Trade Center and said he was flying back to Washington. It didn't turn out that way, at least not directly and immediately. John Roberts has more on the President's Day and his response tonight. John?
Dan, we'll take you through more of the President's Day in just a moment, but for the moment, the President denounced tonight in the strongest terms what he called evil, despicable acts of terror, and he promised that those responsible would be identified and brought to justice. But there was no talk of retaliation tonight, nor even possible leads as to who might be responsible. It is far too early for that, White House aides said.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
From the Oval Office tonight, in the most important moment of his 9-month-old presidency, George Bush offered a grieving nation words of resolve and reassurance.
Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America.
The enormity of the tragedy yet to be fully realized, the president sought to soothe the raw pain of what may be thousands of victims' families. And he sent a clear message to those responsible for these heinous crimes.
We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
The president was in Florida when word of the attacks first broke. Reading with a group of elementary students, Mr. Bush was stopped cold when his chief of staff delivered the news.
Move everybody across the street.
Moments later, in Washington, an urgent call to evacuate the White House.
I'm told that a plane went into the Pentagon and they're chasing us off the grounds here.
It was an extraordinary scene as staff and the press corps were rushed from the grounds. If the Pentagon had been targeted, the Secret Service feared the president's home could be next.
And then everybody back, everybody back.
Fire trucks took up positions on Pennsylvania Avenue, while SWAT teams stood vigil from the roof. Police sealed off a 2-block area around the White House. The only ones left inside the mansion, the vice president and his national security team, coordinating a response to the crisis from the Situation Room. With a continuing threat in Washington, the Secret Service would not allow the president to return and had him fly immediately to the security of Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward.
Shaken and solemn, Mr. Bush addressed the nation and vowed these acts of terrorism will not stand.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
From Barksdale, the president headed for Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, home of the Strategic Air Command, where he conferred with his national security staff about how to proceed. Confident that the White House had been secured, he then headed back for Washington, determined to send a signal to the world that America would stand strong in the face of these horrible acts. The main message of tonight's address by the president, America will recover. The government will be open for business tomorrow. America's economy will be open for business tomorrow, he said. America has stood down enemies before, the president addressed the nation tonight, and it will do so again. But he added, no one will ever forget this day. And it is safe to say that in Washington and across the country tonight, there is no question. Everything has changed. Dan?
Live from, again, now on the grounds of the White House, our chief White House correspondent, John Roberts. I want to take you now again live, transport you by television to the lower end of the tip of Manhattan. Darkness descended 2.5 hours ago. In many ways, it's black as a crow's wing down there now, except for the fires that are still burning. There have been losses among New York City's firefighters and police in the rubble, the disaster that is this part of New York. But now on into the night, Their fellow firefighters and policemen are down. One, trying to put out the fires that remain. Two, trying to look through the rubble for survivors. There are people trapped in the rubble. We reported to you a short while ago an actual case of a man who called on his cell phone to his family out of state saying, "This is where I am, send somebody to get me." Combing the rubble for possible survivors, also combing the rubble for additional bodies. Much of the chaos of earlier in the day has disappeared, but the enormity of what has happened is sinking deeper and deeper into the consciousness of this city and this nation tonight. With me back at our CBS News World headquarters here in New York, Judith Miller, the New York Times and one of the world's ranking authorities on the Middle East, and for that matter on Osama bin Laden. Especially among journalists who speak English, Ms. Miller may be the authority. But thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Dan.
First of all, Osama bin Laden. Many Americans have no idea who he is and what he represents. Put a frame around Osama bin Laden for us.
Well, Dan, I think you've seen the pictures of him, this tall Saudi with a beard, wielding a Kalashnikov, moving furtively around Afghanistan, which harbors him. I think he is the leader now, the mastermind, the financier of a network that we don't look at very much. It's called Al-Qaeda, and it means the base. And it's the base from which Osama bin Laden hopes to launch his worldwide jihad against America.
How did this man get to this position? Acquaintances of mine in Afghanistan, people who are involved in repelling the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, several of them described bin Laden to me in these terms. He was a Toyota warrior. He was a rich, spoiled Saudi who came there, ran around a Toyota pickup truck, supplied a lot of money, and they appreciated that. But he was hardly a frontline warrior firing at the Soviets point-blank range or going hand-to-hand with him. How did he suddenly get to be this icon?
Well, I think he became enamored of his own reputation, and he understood after the Soviet Union was expelled from Afghanistan that ordinary Muslims, if they were armed and well-trained, could accomplish wonders. They could even defeat the United States if he helped train them. And so after the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, he made that his life's mission, to set up camps in Afghanistan, in the Sudan, wherever he could find a host, to train young Muslim militants from all over the world who would be willing to give themselves, their lives up for Allah to accomplish this goal. It was a distortion of Islam as we know it, but it had great appeal to young people who were disaffected from 50 countries. He's had more than 5,000 young militants from 50 countries move through his network of camps, the dozen camps that he personally finances and controls through his agents.
Let's talk about state-sponsored terrorism. Real or imagined here in the first edges of the 21st century, and how, if at all, does it fit in with Osama bin Laden?
Well, I think we used to think that only a state could do something like what we saw today.
Judith Miller, excuse me for a moment. I know you'll forgive this. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani is speaking live here in New York. We want to pick that up.
2730. That's 1-212-560-2730. If you have questions throughout the night and tomorrow, that's the number to call rather than 911, which you should just call if there is an emergency. We had over 1,100 emergency room visits today that we know of. So far, we have 6 fatalities that we know of, 5 at St. Vincent's. Obviously and tragically, there are going to be a lot more than that, but that's what we know of at this point. We had over 300 patients that were treated at St. Vincent's, over 160 at Bellevue, 250 at Beekman Downtown Hospital. And the hospital, these hospitals were probably the ones under the most stress, but they were able to get through. I want to thank all the people that helped St. Vincent's getting the water that they needed and the support that they needed. Also, I'd like to say to people that might consider doing this that services should be made available in New York City tomorrow on a fair and equitable basis. Anybody that thinks that they're going to gouge consumers or ask for extra amounts of money for food or anything else, we're going to have the police and the Consumer Affairs Department out there. So just be careful. This is a time in which we all have to cooperate and help each other. Alternate side street parking is suspended. Sanitation services will take place in most of the city, except obviously in the lower part of Manhattan, where the sanitation department will be working to remove debris, which has already started. And the schools, again, will be closed tomorrow. And hopefully we'll get them open as soon as possible. Tomorrow the effort will be at trying to recover as many people as possible and trying to clean up the horrible mess that was created by all of this. And I would ask people to cooperate as much as possible in that effort. If you have to come into Manhattan because your business is essential, then obviously do it. The upper part of Manhattan will be open. But if tomorrow is a day in which you want to stay home and stay with your family and give comfort and support maybe to other people that have been affected by this, it would be a good day to do that. Yeah, the point that Richie Shearer makes is people are wonderful, and I mean this in the best sense of the word. We've had thousands and thousands of people that have come to help us. When I was down at the site near the World Trade Center, I met a lot of the National Guard's people that the governor has sent, really wonderful young men and women. We have enough volunteers now. We have more volunteers, frankly, than we need at this point. And what we need to do is to focus the efforts of the professionals that are there in being able to do the recovery and try to save as many lives as we can and restore services as quickly as possible. We may be asking for more volunteers tomorrow and the next day and the day after, but right now we don't need any more volunteers.
Mr. Mayor, is there still hope that there are people who are still alive and well?
Yes, there's hope. There's hope that there are people that are still still alive.
How is the rescue effort hampered by the darkness? What do you do?
We moved a lot of lights in so that the area is being lit now, so that I don't think the rescue effort is going to be hampered by the darkness. The rescue effort is hampered by the fact that there's still fire there. There are still unsound structures, and it's still dangerous, although the rescue effort is now taking place. But if you're asking me, is it hampered? It's hampered because of the conditions, not because of...
You are watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America.
Bulldozers and other heavy construction equipment making its way down to lower Manhattan. What is that going to be used for?
That's going to be used to move debris out of the way so that the emergency vehicles can get in and out quickly, so that we can get the ambulances in in a more expeditious fashion than we've been able to do. And I want to thank the Deputy Mayor Rudy Washington, who has spent most of the day coordinating, getting all of that emergency equipment in the right place, ready to move. If you go along Houston Street, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of pieces of equipment that are lined up to move in and to take debris out. And now they've started doing that. And I think that's probably what you observed. You probably observed them starting the...
Are you concerned about the city tonight in light of what all of the things that have happened during the daylight hours today?
Am I concerned from the point of view of the actions and activities of the people of the city? The police department is out in large numbers. You want to explain the force that you have out there? And no, I'm not concerned. But
we're pretty much out in full force this evening. Southern Manhattan, as you know, we're primarily concentrating on the rescue efforts. The rest of the city is basically, some of the entry points are shut down. The tunnels are shut down. As of midnight, there will be no more traffic coming into Southern Manhattan from 14th Street. We're going to shut that down. I think the city's pretty secure, and we're going to continue doing what we're doing in the rescue effort and just hope for the best.
Mr. Mayor, any reports of lawlessness, any reports of any looting or anything?
Absolutely not. There's been no reports of looting or any other problems out of the ordinary. And as I said, the boroughs are working pretty normally, and so far so good.
Mayor, did you see the president's comments tonight, and have you spoken to him again since?
No, I spoke to him earlier today, and I only heard the very end of his comments because I was coming back from the World Trade Center.
He said 1,000 per day.
I don't know the number at this point. And that may be very well be the case. At this point,
let's go to them now.
We're still in the effort of trying to recover people. I don't know the numbers yet, but I mean, this is going to be, as I said, the numbers are going to be very, very high.
Mr. Mayor,
just if you think of the number of people that were in the building at the time, we've been spending time with the medical examiner, who, by the way, was injured himself, and so Dr. Hirsch was injured and had to be treated, but he's organized his office, and they are ready to deal with thousands and thousands of.
New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, the primary election to help select a new mayor was called off in New York today, of course. David Martin in Washington, our national security correspondent at the Pentagon, has breaking news. David?
Dan, a local fire department official has just told reporters here that they have searched the building and believe they have gotten all the survivors out of the building now, and they have accounted for 60 people in area hospitals. And this same official said he believes there are somewhere between 100 and 800 bodies now in the Pentagon waiting to be found. Now, that is obviously a very wide estimate, 100 to 800, but those were the numbers he had.
David Martin reporting live from the Pentagon. David, want to underscore here that this fire official who's been inside the Pentagon now thinks there's 100 to 800 bodies in there. Of course, that's a wide variance of numbers, but any way you look at it, another catastrophe, sometimes that's an overworked word, but in this instance it is apt, a catastrophe at the Defense Department. Bob Orr, who covers aviation for CBS News, also has breaking news at this hour. Bob?
Well, Dan, we're learning more and more from the radar data from these 4 flights, and I have to tell you, this just adds to the horror. People may have the idea that these planes took off and then fairly quickly impacted the targets. That's not the case. For example, just a short time ago, we learned more about the flight that hit the Pentagon that David Martin was just talking about. This plane apparently was in the air for 1 hour and 18 minutes. If you can imagine the kind of horror that must have been on board for the people on that plane. This plane took off from Dulles. The Pentagon's only 20 miles by air from Dulles, if it's that, but the plane went all the way to the Ohio-Kentucky border, according to radar, and then turned around and made a beeline back to Washington. Just quickly, the 2 that hit the World Trade Center, one flight was in the air about 48 minutes, according to preliminary radar data. The other one about 40 minutes. And then this is the worst of all, the plane that came down in rural Pennsylvania. If the radar data is correct, we think it is, the plane was in the air at least 1 hour and 40 minutes going all the way from Newark, all the way up to Cleveland, Ohio, looping around, heading towards Pittsburgh, and then crashing in the field. It's also important to know that that plane may give us the best clues the quickest, because the black boxes on all 4 of these jets, the cockpit voice tapes, could tell authorities what happened in the cockpit, who was behind the attack, and exactly how the takeovers were done. The reason that plane is important in Pennsylvania is because the crash scene, I'm told, is easily accessible, and it's hoped by the authorities that they have that cockpit tape very quickly. Dan?
Bob Orr in Washington with more details of the terror in the sky. Stabbings now confirmed on at least 2 of the hijacked planes and possibly a third, as those aircraft, in one case, in the air for 1 hour and 40 minutes of the passengers and crew being terrorized by, among other things, at knife point. And we know that some, or let me say we believe we know, there's credible information indicating that some flight attendants on at least 2 of the airplanes were stabbed while the hijackings were in progress. The attack struck at the heart of New York's financial district. That was one of the purposes of striking there, to strike at a symbol of American economic power. It was timed at the rush hour for maximum impact and maximum casualties. And the attack succeeded. It all obliterated the World Trade Center, and it spread terror block by block, as Byron Pitts reports.
8:48 a.m., mayhem in Manhattan.
We saw a plane coming very low, and everyone said, wow, that plane is very, very low.
Come on, guys, keep
I was walking to work and all of a sudden I see a jet crash into the first tower.
An American Airlines flight loaded with 92 people crashes head-on into the North Tower of the World Trade Center.
And then we heard the crash. We ran to the window.
Into the building. It went into the Trade Center.
We hit the Trade Center. We saw the shrapnel fall, and then we said, "Get out!"
And minutes later.
Oh, there's another one. Another plane just hit. Right. Oh my God! Another plane has just hit.
I heard a roar, and I looked around thinking that it had to be a helicopter, and I looked up and I saw the second plane hit.
A second commercial plane, a United Airlines jet, also hijacked, carrying 65 people, plows into the South Tower.
First one we thought was an accident. When we heard there was a second one, we definitely thought it was terrorism.
On the ground, witnesses could not believe their eyes. 70 stories up with the building burning. Reason gave way to desperation. New York's bravest never had a chance.
We really never even got to that close to the building. The explosion blew and it knocked everybody over.
Less than an hour later, the South Tower came crumbling down.
It collapsed. The top floors collapsed down. I saw it blow and then ran like hell. Thank God. I'm 69, but I can still run.
But it was far from over.
Tower 2 collapsed into Tower 1. Within minutes after that, we were ordered out.
When the dust settled, signs of life started to emerge.
Chaos. There's chaos out here. It really is. So the Twin Towers fall. It's amazing. It's crazy. I can't believe this shit is happening. I really can't. It's nightmares. Armageddon right here.
This was the worst act of terrorism on U.S. soil, but not the first attack on the World Trade Center. 8 years ago, terrorists set off bombs in the basement in an effort to take down the two towers. They failed. Today, mission accomplished.
I tell you what, it's a sad day for America. It really is.
By 2 o'clock this afternoon, firefighters and police officers and paramedics by the hundreds stood by, many of them feeling helpless. There was nothing they could do at this point because the building was still unsecured.
Our main priority is to get in, do a search and rescue, look for survivors, and then clean up what's left. And we can't do that until the building is deemed safe.
Ankle deep in debris and despair, rescue workers waited. Some had relatives of their own inside. One police officer told me her sister worked here on the 40th floor, due in at 9 a.m. She was always early, she said. Always. A sign on a paramedic's van spoke volumes.
We know we have some of the major brass of our department missing. We're trying to find them still.
New York Port Authority Police Chief William Hall choked back tears. For him, this was no longer just work.
On a personal level, because I know that these are all your men and it's a business, but I'm sure that a lot of these guys are your friends. How you holding up?
It's business now, it's personal now.
Sir?
It's personal now. We have to get them.
Back alive here in Lower Manhattan, New York City's mayor announced a few minutes ago that 6 people have died at area hospitals. The New York City Policemen's Union says 87 police officers are missing. The New York City Fire Union says that 200 firefighters are dead. All of them in harm's way when this second tower collapsed this morning. At this hour, several buildings are still on fire behind me, about 3 blocks behind me over my shoulder. Rescue workers by the hundreds, policemen, firefighters, doctors, paramedics are all waiting, dressed, ready to go inside the building when the word comes. Dan, a short time ago, we felt a cool breeze here off the Hudson River. It was the first time since 8:48 this morning any of us have tasted fresh air. Dan.
Byron Pitts on the scene as night deepens and the realization of the horror deepens here in New York City. 1 point for accuracy. Byron Pitts ticking off the facts about missing people, and I believe it was said that 200 firefighters are dead. The best available information, this is for precise accuracy in which we pride ourselves in here whenever possible, that a fire department union official said there may be 200 firemen dead. I know of no confirmed reports. In fact, I feel confident saying there are no confirmed reports of how many firemen are dead, but certainly some are, partly because they rushed to the scene of the first World Trade Center tower that was hit by a plane this morning, and then when the second one, incredibly, was hit, and the collapse of the buildings that followed, creating a version of Apocalypse Now in that portion of Manhattan. Many firemen unquestionably died, but the exact number is not known. Joining us now from Washington, D.C., the man who was until recently the U.S. Defense Secretary, former Senator from Maine, former Congressman William Cohen. Mr. Secretary, Senator, thanks for being with us tonight. You've dealt with this problem over the years as a member of the Armed Services Committee, then as Secretary of Defense. As the hours wear on, what are the most important things for us as Americans to have in mind?
Well, the most important thing is that this country is going to respond. It will respond in a way that will certainly send a message to those who have committed this act of monumental and pure evil. Secondly, I think it's also clear that we'll take every measure possible to prevent a similar type of attack in the future, understanding that we have come to grips with a reconciliation of two conflicting interests in this country. How we can defend and protect our people and how we can defend and protect our civil liberties. And we've got to engage in a very intensive debate and dialogue on how we reconcile those two very important ideals and needs for our country. But I think President Bush sent the right message tonight. It's one of resolve and determination that the long arm of justice is going to reach out and touch those individuals and those groups who support the individuals involved, and most importantly, the countries that give safe harbor to the terrorists who are committing these acts. So I think that the American people are going to certainly coalesce around the President and his national security team and the entire Congress. You will see, in my judgment, a consolidation of American opinion. They will be unified. They will, I hope, really be stirred and shaken from any sense of lethargy that we may have been experiencing in recent years about our security interests, and to be shaken from our apathy, to become deeply involved in supporting the men and women who support us on the front lines. And that's not only the military men and women, and they are very important, but also, as you saw on that screen, the firemen, the policemen, the paramedics, the medical professionals. We're all in this together. And that's the one message that's going to come out of all of this, that we are going to be united in a way that perhaps we haven't seen since World War II.
Mr. Secretary, you were part of the decision-making process when President Clinton made the decision to retaliate for the bombing of our embassies in East Africa. We sent the cruise missiles, Sudan and Afghanistan. In retrospect, which is all we can talk about, a mistake? Put that in context for us.
Not a mistake. It was a very strong message that we were seeking to send, that if you are going to train and prepare to carry out acts of terrorism against the United States, here or abroad, then the United States is going to take whatever measures we need to prevent that from occurring in the future. This was an act of prevention. We knew from intelligence sources that they were planning more acts of terrorism. We knew from intelligence sources that they were trying to get their hands on a weapon of mass destruction. And we took action accordingly. And I believe that we will see very strong action coming from this president and this administration, supported not only by the people of this country, but I believe by nations the world over, who also see that terrorism is not confined by any geographical boundaries. It can reach out and destroy the lives and the lifestyle of millions of people all across this globe. So this is a universal threat. And we need to have the support of our allies and our friends and make them understand that when we take action, it needs to be concerted, it needs to be concentrated, and it needs to be consistent and with their support.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense and Senator Bill Cohen, thank you. President Bush has just declared New York City a federal disaster area. That will trigger a flow of federal aid to people and businesses. Just for example, Morgan Stanley had some 3,500 people in the South Tower, 25 floors of offices in the World Trade Center complex. I'm not saying that Morgan Stanley per se is going to get any of this federal help, but it's an indication of why the president has declared New York City a federal disaster area, to say nothing of the loss of life and the wounded. Exact totals on those killed and wounded, we frankly have no idea. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani has been straightforward throughout the day and evening, saying we simply don't know. It may be a long time before we know. David Martin reported a short while ago that a firefighting authority who'd been in the Pentagon for most of the day, the Pentagon struck by one of those hijacked airliners, said that he believed that there were 100 to 800 bodies in the Pentagon that have yet to be recovered. That was his opinion. Chaos reigned throughout New York City for at least part of this morning. People got steady and calmed after the initial shock of what was happening. As Troy Roberts reports, no one who lives or works in this city was untouched by it.
It started with a plane crash.
It's like, oh my God, it did. A plane crashed into the World Trade Center.
Literally out of the blue.
Thursday, AA on the wing, just going, I'm like, what the heck is that? Is it filming a movie here or something? Then all of a sudden, bam.
Brothers Jeff and Scott Such were there, ground zero, with their video camera.
You're good right here in the corner. Stay in the corner.
So after the first strike, you're not thinking terrorist attack, are you?
You're thinking this is a really huge accident that I should be seeing this, so we just decided to go even closer.
The brothers continued shooting this videotape. As people trapped in the building began falling from the windows.
It almost looked as if someone had just like stepped backwards and had fallen through a window.
What's this other jet doing?
But the terrorists weren't done. 20 minutes later, another plane, another tower, another devastating attack.
Boom, just a loud explosion, and then you just look up to the sky because that's where it came from. The noise came from above. You look up and it's just like confetti in the sky.
And that was just the beginning. On the ground, chaos as one of the famed Twin Towers crumbles. Firefighters and rescue workers attack the other tower, still standing, still burning. Who knows how many trapped inside.
So start going to your trucks. Make sure you got flashlights. If you don't have any lights, then let me know.
Then that tower collapses too.
And we had some time to get some of the people out, but then there was those secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses. So I don't know how many people were in there. I know there was a lot of firefighters, a lot of public safety personnel were in there.
You call her and you tell her, let her hear your voice. She's going to need to hear your voice. Just like you need to hear my voice, I'm okay. I'm okay. Thank you. Bye. See you later. I love you.
All day long, more fallout.
Because there might be a bomb in the school, maybe.
A reported bomb threat. A dangerous gas leak.
This is Ed Sullivan. I want that building evacuated. All civilians, please head north of Moore Street.
Then, a nearby building collapses from the day's damage.
You are watching Building 7 at the World Trade Center collapse.
Amid the destruction and devastation, though, one remarkable thing did happen. Today's tragedy brought out the best in a city not always known for its kindness and humanity. 3 hours after the attack, area residents have put out an open call for volunteers to search the rubble for any signs of possible survivors.
They're here to volunteer. They're a laborer, they're a plumber, they're an electrician, whatever they are, it's to stay with you guys. If they're medical, they go across the street.
We're CPR and first aid trained.
You're prepared to go into that rubble?
Yeah, unfortunately we are. You know, whatever we can do to help out. I know there's not enough people in the city of New York to do it. I mean, it's a mess over there.
These volunteers say there is just one thing they want, something uniquely New York. Street justice, tough and immediate.
I hope they're sending planes over there right now. Take care of business.
The world was caught unprepared for what happened today, especially in New York City and especially among those coordinating rescue efforts. 60 Minutes' Leslie Stahl has that story. Leslie?
Dan, ever since the Cold War, the federal government has had an elaborate plan to keep the government running if the Soviets ever attacked Washington. Over a year ago, I spoke with then President Clinton's counterterrorism czar, Dick Clark, who has the same job today under President Bush. He told us that when the Cold War ended, they decided to hold on to that plan to keep the government running.
We thought that individual buildings in Washington, and indeed perhaps all of Washington, could still come under attack. Only it might not be from the former Soviet Union, it might not be with a missile flying over the poles, it might be with a terrorist walking a weapon into our city. And the city could still be attacked and put out of action. And therefore, we have developed a new program so that the federal government's emergency capabilities will continue to operate, even if Washington doesn't.
So tell us what kind of operation you have up and running, or at least ready to be operational.
As soon as Washington goes down, the Pentagon, the Justice Department, the FBI, the Coast Guard, all of the key agencies of the U.S. government devolve power to other centers, some secret locations, some urban centers elsewhere, but we have a plan, we have trained people, we exercise it regularly, that if Washington isn't around, the U.S. government continues.
So is there a shadow Treasury Department somewhere right now?
For every one of our major departments, there's a shadow department somewhere right now.
There's a shadow Oval Office?
There are facilities where the president could operate, where a future president could operate, and for each of our key departments. Again, the message...
Is it like a bunker, or is it a... Can you give us any information?
It's an elaborate system, and it involves both old-fashioned bunkers and new-fashioned methods. Let's just say that. It's survivable. That's the key point.
Well, it seems that parts of this plan was activated, or at least contemplated today, when President Bush was flown from Louisiana to Nebraska, but then deactivated when it was determined not only that it was safe for him to return to Washington, but that it was important that it not look as though our government was crippled and on the run. Now, there has also been an elaborate plan here in New York City to react to something like what happened today, a terrorist attack with mass casualties. And as we came upon elements of that as we drove around the city. This is the scene we came upon 20 blocks north of the Trade Center. Row upon row of ambulances from all around New York and its suburbs. Had you gone through a training program for just this kind of an incident?
Maybe not this catastrophic, but it's definitely trained.
The ambulances were lined up in front of a huge commercial complex that was being transformed into an emergency triage center.
There's a coordinated plan in conjunction with the fire department and New York City EMS. The plan calls for that when we have volunteers, at this time we have over 300 attending surgeons, 300 residents, nurses, paramedics, physician assistants, and nurse practitioners, all inside, broken up into teams.
How many patients will you be able to operate on in here?
We have, I think, 50 operating suites and enough to handle about 400 patients that we set up at this time.
More and more medical personnel arrived throughout the day. They waited and waited for the wounded. It's now more than 6 hours since the first plane hit the World Trade Center. The doctors, nurses, medical supplies are still coming into this triage center that they're still organizing. And as far as we can tell, they have not yet brought a single patient in from ground zero. In other words, from anybody who may have been in the World Trade Center itself. We're still seeing the ambulances lining up. No patients. They're still clearing the area down there. As emergency medical personnel had to change their plans on the fly, so did the big Wall Street investment firms. In driving around, we came upon a knot of people on 11th Street trying desperately to get their cell phones to work. And who were they?
Right at the moment, this is the command headquarters for Merrill Lynch around the world. So,
really,
little
living
townhouse in the village, yeah.
Is the global center of Merrill Lynch.
Right for the moment. Right for the moment, yeah.
Little black door right there.
Yep.
This is Paul Critchlow's house in Greenwich Village. He's Merrill Lynch's director of communications. When the first plane hit the World Trade Center, his company's emergency evacuation plan kicked in.
We heard an explosion, and we thought it was most of us thought it was a supersonic, boom or something. And then we started getting reports from our own security people and obviously on TV and radio. And then we heard a second explosion, and I'd say right around 9 o'clock we ordered an evacuation of both of our buildings, which are adjacent to the World Trade Centers in the World Financial Center. So about 9,000 people, right.
9,000 people evacuated.
9,000 people, right.
So how did you get up here?
We walked.
9,000 people walked?
Well, everybody evacuated either to the north or to the south.
It's like a biblical exodus.
It really is. And so basically now you have these people are all senior executives and communications personnel. And this is where we're regrouping to try to figure out how we mobilize to keep our operations trading and all that sort of thing, and to find out what's the status with regard to all of our employees.
Government agencies, medical staff, and companies all had plans. But most New Yorkers simply didn't know what to do. And so, we're just a couple of blocks from that new Merrill Lynch headquarters. Just a couple of blocks, we came upon St. Vincent's Hospital. And all these people that you see behind me are all lined up in different lines to donate blood. They're lined up by their blood type. There must be between 5,000 and 10,000 people here.
You're sitting there wondering what you can do and how you can help, and you can't go down there.
And you feel helpless.
And you feel helpless, and you want to contribute, and
If you look around, there are so many people here who want to donate blood. There are people who are giving out free food. There are people giving water, and I mean, it's small comfort. But at the same time, it's like the worst brings out the best in people, and that's what you are seeing.
As I walked around today, there were a lot of people in the streets, and what struck me was how quiet it was. This is a city of really loud people, but not today. Taxi drivers weren't even blowing their horns. Now, you might have expected to find anger, but what we encountered was shock and sadness and, Dan, profound silence.
And that silence extends tonight. I want to show you a live picture. This is looking south on Manhattan Island. South toward Our Lady of Liberty, the Statue of Liberty. The right-hand side of your screen, great Empire State Building in Midtown Manhattan, and then beyond, the smoke and, yes, still the flames from what happened today at the World Trade Center. Now, this just in from New York City. Marcia Kramer, former newspaper woman now working with WCBS TV in New York, says that sources have told her that 2 people have been arrested with explosives under the George Washington Bridge. The George Washington Bridge, for those of you unfamiliar with the city, connects a part of New Jersey with Manhattan. So 2 people arrested on the GW Bridge in a truck with explosives, is this report. Now, whether it was connected with the events of the day, we do not know, but an interesting report. President Bush said tonight, "Our nation today saw evil." And referring to scenes just such as this is the live shot in Manhattan tonight, the president says, "These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve." Unquote, President Bush tonight. You are watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America.
Tonight, attack on America.
And I saw the plane hit the building.
And a nightmare unfolds.
It's got to be a terrorist attack.
In New York, hijacked planes slam into the World Trade Center.
Move out of the way! Let's go! Hey, come on!
And the Twin Towers crumble. In Washington, a plane dives into the Pentagon.
We are at threat condition Delta. That is the highest condition that we can go to.
And near Pittsburgh,
witnesses reported seeing the large passenger plane take a nosedive.
still another plane crashes.
Some 44 people on board, all believed dead.
A country is outraged. The world is stunned.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Let the whole city room to breathe!
Who is behind it? What happens next? The deadliest attack ever to strike America. As terror hits home.
Terror hits home. In the history of our country, we had Remember the Alamo, then remember the Maine during the Spanish-American War. We had to remember Pearl Harbor, and now remember the Twin Towers. We're back now live at CBS News World Headquarters in New York. CBS's special coverage of the attack on America rolls on. The headlines at this hour. In a White House address tonight to the American people, President Bush said, quote, thousands of lives were suddenly ended, unquote, in today's terror attacks on targets in New York, in and around the nation's capital, and in southwestern Pennsylvania. President Bush said the United States will not distinguish between the terrorists behind the acts and those who committed the acts and those who harbor them. Here in New York City, well into the night, the desperate search for victims continues at the site where two hijacked commercial U.S. jetliners were used to ram the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Both towers, where generally speaking about 50,000 people work, collapsed. A third building in the tower complex collapsed later in the day, a 47-story building, World Trade Center Building 7. President Bush says the death toll is in the thousands. A third hijacked jetliner was sent slamming into the Pentagon. A fire department source at the Pentagon is now quoted by CBS's David Martin as saying 100 to 800 bodies may still be trapped inside the complex there, underscore the word may. A fourth hijacked plane, possibly being diverted to the Washington area, crashed about 80 miles from Pittsburgh in southwestern Pennsylvania. Now, at least 285 people were killed on the hijacked planes alone, and a picture's been created from 911 cell phone calls and others of stewardesses being attacked, flight attendants being attacked on these aircraft with knives, and at least two of the planes and possibly a third that is believed to have happened. Passengers were terrorized on some of the flights for a long while before the planes crashed. The Federal Aviation Authority has ordered an unprecedented shutdown of air traffic nationwide that will last at least through noon tomorrow. The U.S. military is on alert. The financial markets will be closed tomorrow. They will be closed until further notice, but we're told they will be closed tomorrow. CBS News national correspondent David Martin is covering developments at the Defense Department at the Pentagon tonight. David?
Dan, a little more on that estimate of between 100 and 800 bodies still trapped inside the Pentagon. The high number, 800, is based on the fact that 850 people are believed to work in that area of the Pentagon, and they've gotten 60 survivors accounted for in area hospitals, so that's where you get the high number of 800. The low number comes from the fact that 67 people were on board the plane that crashed into the Pentagon, and that's where the estimate of 100 bodies still trapped in there originates. That's an awfully wide margin of error, but that's the best information they have right now.
David, the Pentagon is trying to get back to as close to normal as it can. How realistic is it that the Pentagon will be able to operate with anything approaching efficiency tomorrow?
Well, I think you can operate the United States military. The command centers never went down, and of course there are command centers at all the regional commands as well. So the ships will steam, the planes will fly. That's not the problem, but a lot of routine business of managing this huge enterprise called the defense of the United States will not get done simply because so much of that building is going to take months, if not years, to repair.
David Martin live outside the Pentagon, where a fire department official says 100 to 800 bodies may yet be in the Pentagon. Now, WCBS TV News in New York is reporting 2 people arrested by the FBI in a truck with explosives under the George Washington Bridge. The DW Bridge spans the Hudson River connecting New York City and New Jersey. Whether this arrest by the FBI is connected with other events in the day, one can only question. More than 1,000 victims of the World Trade Center attack were taken to New York City hospitals, stretching resources to the limit, and that includes up to this hour. CBS News medical correspondent Elizabeth Caledon is at New York University Medical Center for us tonight. Elizabeth?
Well, Dan, ambulances and police emergency vehicles continue to stream by here as they have been doing all day, but it really could be days before we know the exact number of injured and dead. and that means more grueling days of work for area hospitals, doctors, and nurses. Now, nearly all the hospitals in the region were instantaneously transformed into trauma centers, with every bit of space being used for patient care. And as hard as it is to imagine that this could ever happen, hospitals here say they were prepared for it. By evening, the numbers of injured were stacking up at New York City hospitals: 140 at Bellevue, more than 300 at St. Vincent's. The most serious cases carried by dust-covered ambulances to whatever emergency centers could take them.
We had people with severe burns covering most of their bodies and their faces. We had a variety of people that came in cardiac arrest.
Bellevue, one of the city's biggest trauma centers, treated injured when the World Trade Towers were bombed back in 1993. Today, it was déjà vu. Patients here were treated for burns and smoke inhalation, head injuries, and broken bones.
They actually extricated one guy that had his legs amputated. He said that the amount of patients, the extent of the injuries, you can't really predict.
It was also déjà vu for Marlene Cruz, who was at work the day the World Trade Towers were bombed, and now this. He was in an elevator that plummeted when the plane hit the building.
I was screaming because I didn't know what the hell was going on. I had all the debris, concrete, and everything fall on top, you know, so I wasn't sure.
Doctors speculate they are just beginning to see the extent of death and injury. There will be much more to come in the days ahead. Even emergency medical people trained for this type of thing can't believe it's happening.
It's an unbelievable thing. You keep thinking that you're about to wake up and it was all just a nightmare, and it really isn't real. I mean, it's just so unbelievable that this would happen.
A call for blood brought out hundreds of donors, too many for the hospital to accommodate. Those turned away are being asked to come back again in the coming days. In addition to the physical injuries, of course, another major concern is the psychological wounds, the people who survived all this, the people who witnessed the unforgettable sight of bodies hurling out of those World Trade Tower windows. They will also be included in the numbers of victims and are likely to require medical intervention, Dan, possibly for years to come. Dan?
Elizabeth Caledon at New York University Hospital, St. Vincent's Hospital, which is right on the edge of the disaster area, along with NYU Hospital and so many other New York City hospitals, been doing Herculean work all during the day and now well into the night. Even U.S. cities that were not targeted specifically by the terrorists felt the aftershocks of today's attacks as airports closed and life ground to a halt or something nearing that in many sections of many cities. Bill Whitaker has that story from Los Angeles. Bill?
Dan, it's the nature of terrorism that victims don't know where or when the next will occur. So even here, 3,000 miles away, the terror and the horror struck deep. The Crystal Cathedral in Orange County opened its doors to all faiths to come together for comfort and support. While some turned to prayer, others turned to force. FBI agents with fingers at the ready ring the main federal building in Los Angeles. For some, the shock is turning to anger. Muslim groups in Los Angeles say they're receiving death threats and pleaded with their countrymen not to blame all for what a few may have done.
The pain of this country is, in fact, our pain.
The Los Angeles city attorney called for unity and calm.
As residents of the most diverse city in the world, we must also be careful not to allow these terrorists to turn us against each other and target or blame certain ethnic groups.
But with all the hijacked planes originally headed for California, the state is feeling vulnerable. Fearing the nation's second largest city might also be a target, workers fled downtown high-rises, leaving the heart of Los Angeles a ghost town. City government, law enforcement, indeed the entire city was on high alert.
We believe that whatever could have happened in New York could very likely happen here.
The entire West was on alert. The Transamerica Pyramid in San Francisco, even Seattle's Space Needle closed down, leaving tourists stunned.
To Pearl Harbor magnified 10 times.
There's heightened alert on the Golden Gate and Bay Bridges, San Francisco's main links. Even Disneyland, the self-proclaimed happiest place on earth, joined other California amusement parks and closed down in fear.
Obviously, what they want is to shut down the country, and that's exactly what they've done.
I mean, it's scary to think that something like this could happen in the United States. I mean, you feel safe here, and now you don't feel as safe.
The West's water and energy suppliers are taking no chances either. At Hoover Dam, boats and bomb-sniffing dogs are on patrol. Armed guards stand outside the San Onofre nuclear plant near San Diego. The Navy threw up barricades at its 32nd Street station, also in San Diego. Up the road, Marine Camp Pendleton went on Threat Condition D, the highest level of alert, meaning an attack is expected or imminent.
Right now, they are checking every car that's on base.
People wanting, even needing to do something lined up in San Diego and in Los Angeles to give blood. But with special edition headlines screaming terror, many other people are feeling helpless.
We are held hostage until we find out exactly who did it, and we don't know. And what measures should we take to do that and to prevent it? I don't think we're going to be safe for a while.
Even despite the best efforts of the best of us, Jim Laval is the brother-in-law of John Oganowski, pilot of American Flight 11, the first plane to slam into the World Trade Center. He says he's sure his brother-in-law pilot resisted any hijackers with all his strength.
I cannot even begin to fathom John Oganowski doing that. I mean, you know, he would walk through a fire with a suit made of gasoline for his passengers before he would do something like that.
Tonight there are prayer services throughout the West, Americans coming together to pray for the victims and their country. Dan?
Bill Whitaker live from Los Angeles. Now, the Associated Press, along with some other news organizations, reported that the New York City Police Commissioner had confirmed that there were people known to be alive inside the World Trade Center. Now, for clarification and accuracy, the police commissioner has said that there are people alive in nearby buildings downtown, nearby to the actual collapsed buildings area, but the police commissioner did not say he knew of people alive in the Trade Center itself. Mayor Giuliani has said earlier that he believed that there were people alive in the debris, and based on past acts such as the Oklahoma City bombing, the possibility remains alive that there are alive people in some of the debris, but just wanted to clear that up. CBS News correspondent Harold Dow has been covering this story from the beginning. It's far from over, the search for survivors, the digging for wounded, and for that matter, bodies. Harold Dow is on scene as night rolls ever deeper on the lower Manhattan.
Lower Manhattan this afternoon became a deserted war zone. Inches of thick, choking dust, burned out cars, and mountains of rubble have replaced the bustle of the business world.
Everybody keep going!
Everyone has been turned away. The journalists, the curious, even the residents who live here will find themselves homeless tonight.
Hey guys! Hey! We need a 20-foot straight ladder from over here. 20-foot straight ladder.
Only rescue workers are allowed beyond the barriers in their desperate search for victims. It is a truly overwhelming scene. Hundreds of exhausted firefighters and rescue workers climbing over mounds of concrete and tangled metal. A scene that certainly seems more familiar to Americans on a movie screen than in real life.
As we reported earlier, about 200 firefighters are feared dead, and about 87 police officers are reported missing. By tomorrow morning, as many as 3,000 National Guard troops are expected in New York City. So far, 750 Guard troops have reported to various posts in Manhattan. Governor Pataki has also ordered the Guard to bring in heavy equipment such as water tankers, cranes, wreckers, loaders, and dump trucks. And as Dan, night has fallen on lower Manhattan, and as you look into the direction of the World Trade Center, it's still just hard to believe that those two giant towers have been brought down.
Harold Dow, live in lower Manhattan. We have with us at our CBS News World Headquarters news desk and anchor desk in New York, Gary Sick, currently director of the Middle East Institute at the world-famous Columbia University here in New York, former National Security Council member under Presidents Ford, Reagan, and Carter. Thanks for being with us, Mr. Sick.
Pleasure.
What type of planning went into this attack?
I think this is really a key issue because if you simply stop and think about the magnitude of this operation, they were able to penetrate security in 2 major airports, get people on board, provide their own pilots, because they obviously had their own pilots to do.
Suicide pilots?
Suicide pilots, but pilots who were qualified to fly a major airplane. And I personally watched the second plane go into the trade towers, and there was no flinching and no swerving. He flew right straight into it, and it was clear that no American pilot, no commercial pilot would ever have done that. And you stop and think about the amount of time, back it up, how much time would have been required, and the money and the organization. Let's put it this way. What if you're the president in the Cold War days and you tell the CIA that you'd like to create a little operation in Russia, which would basically hijack 4 airplanes and within a period of an hour crash them into major sites in the Soviet Union, and you had to organize that. It would have stretched our capabilities absolutely to the limit. And yet, that's what happened here today.
Reporters are always trained to follow the dollar, look for the money. Who finances an operation like this? Took a lot of money.
It took money and it took professionalism. I personally think that this had to have had a professional organization behind it. If you look at the kind of operations that Osama bin Laden and others have conducted in the past, the most sophisticated stuff they've been able to manage is a car bomb. And car bombs are dangerous and they're deadly, but they aren't like what we saw today. And this business of organizing, they had to recruit in the United States. They had to have Americans. They had to have some way of passing through the security in this country. That meant money, but it meant tremendous organization. And the fact that all of this, if you stop and think about it, it's amazing, went unreported, unnoticed by any of our systems, which were watching all of these specific organizations, raises the question, were we looking in the right place?
Well, let's pursue that question. Whom do you think may be responsible for this?
You know, I really don't want to speculate because I think it's, at this stage it's a pure guess. Everybody is speculating about Osama bin Laden, maybe so. But if so, he has moved his operations to a level that this is the largest and most successful terrorist operation in history. And he was simply not up to that. He had a bomb in a boat, and he had some car bombs outside embassies.
This is far beyond that.
This is something of an, and it's in this country.
Well, let me ask
talking
the question
about East Africa.
I know you don't want to speculate, and neither do I, but it's inevitable as these questions flow on. That if it was or was not Osama bin Laden, you've said it was well financed, it was exceptionally well planned, a very sophisticated and large operation. If the president asks you, what are the chances, Gary said, that Saddam Hussein or one of the radical mullah groups in Iran were responsible, would you rule it out?
Saddam Hussein today said that this was the operation of the century. And there was great celebrations in Baghdad, not in Iran. But, you know, if you had to look for a culprit in terms of organization, structure, money, professionalism, all of the things that go with it, that's one place that you would certainly have to look. And I think that our intelligence services are going to have to do a really careful step back from where they've been looking and start looking under some different rocks, because I think there's some things going on that we haven't really observed.
We have only a few seconds left here, but we spend billions of dollars on intelligence. Does this or any other president have the will to zero base our whole intelligence operations?
No, but intelligence works when you're looking in the right place, and I've seen it. The Israelis in 1973 and elsewhere had the information, but they didn't know what to do with it. They were looking in the wrong way, and they thought they knew what was going on, and they interpreted it wrongly. I think that we need to step back from it and take a hard look at our interpretation of the information that we probably already got.
Gary Sick, thank you very much.
Indeed.
Around the country today, schools closed, churches opened, and the daily routine of life was suddenly changed. Bob McNamara has more now on the attack on America and how it was felt throughout America.
Half a continent away, flags in Dallas were lowered to half-staff as fears climbed.
I'm scared to death about what's going on, and it's just crazy. Everything's crazy.
No matter where you work, no place seems safe.
I
feel like a sitting duck, and I just can't wait to get home.
The doomsday images that filled the day's television screens had Americans on edge. Iowa's state capitol was evacuated. Shopping mall parking lots were vacant. And airports coast to coast were eerily empty as flights were canceled and jetliners parked.
Yes, I'd like to make reservations.
But most stranded travelers kept calm.
I'd rather them shut down everything and inconvenience everybody than to have another tragedy happen.
In Dallas and other cities, a flood of donors answered emergency calls for blood.
Unfortunately, it takes a disaster like this to really show America does care about one another.
The crisis seemed to touch everybody.
First thing I did, I got up and I came in my pajamas, actually, and I just, as fast as I could, try to donate blood.
But the scene here recalled another terror attack.
The only thing I can really compare it to would be the Oklahoma City bombing. The response to that was tremendous as well.
Until today, the Oklahoma City bombing had been the worst act of terror on American soil. And the nightmare of those 6-year-old images brought many to the Oklahoma City National Memorial.
We wanted to stop by and just get a feeling again for what people are feeling in New York, and obviously you get a hard feeling in your stomach when you come to a place like this.
Churches in hundreds of cities and towns held prayer vigils as they do during this nation's darkest hours. But any gathering today was a source of comfort for many.
We'll overcome what's happened. It may take a little time, but we'll do it.
Tonight, though far from the day's chaos, many Americans are feeling vulnerable and trying to stay hopeful in a world full of hurt. Bob McNamara, CBS News, Dallas.
A world full of hurt. And the exact death tolls in New York and in Washington remain open to question tonight. Nobody really knows the number of people killed and or injured. We do believe we know that 285 people, at least 285 people aboard the 4 hijacked planes that were crashed died. So we know that death toll figure is pretty solid. If you were listening closely, you probably did note, if you weren't with us at the time when Gary Sick spoke a few moments ago, one of this country's ranking experts on national security affairs, and he said, this is almost a direct quote, that it may or may not turn out to be Osama bin Laden was at the head of this operation, but, said Gary Sick, it does not fit his profile. And Gary Sick's counsel was to look at other places for perhaps allies who could have been involved in this, or some kind of state-sponsored terrorism. Gary Sick. Now, this attack on America was an attack first and foremost on powerful symbols of our beloved United States. Richard Schlesinger has more on what these symbols represent and why they were targets.
It didn't take long for the images of this sneak attack on the United States to remind people of another one, December 7th, 1941.
A date which will live in infamy.
Pearl Harbor is one of the first things that comes to mind.
Evan Cornog is a Columbia University historian and journalist.
After Pearl Harbor, there was the Japanese fleet to go after. One knew where to find the enemy. Here, it's a much more complicated issue.
Pearl Harbor was an attack on the U.S. Navy, a symbol of American power at the time. Today's attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center struck at modern symbols of American power and prestige.
Those towers are saying, look at us, we're important. And somebody has come along and said, you're not as important as you think.
The pictures of the destruction are destined to become images for the ages.
The image of that airplane crashing into the side of the building, the image of the collapsing towers, those are going to be things that just stay riveted in our memories. Like the flag at Iwo Jima. You see those pictures and a whole era and a whole set of issues is called to mind. And I think we haven't yet seen, don't know yet what all the defining images of this event are going to be. But they're going to be there in our memories as long as we live.
The symbolism of this attack was impossible to ignore overseas.
The feeling is that throughout the world, the Americans are not as powerful as they were thought to be. Therefore, these terrorists were really going to achieve a symbolic victory.
But officials here in New York and in Washington know the difference between a symbolic victory and a real victory. When the World Trade Center was brought to the ground, the country was brought to its knees. But terrorism experts say just for a while. For years, authorities have practiced for attacks like today's. many times under the direction of Jerome Hauer, who was an emergency management official in New York.
You have to plan for the worst. That's just, particularly in a city like in New York, in Washington, D.C., the real thing is never like a drill. The enormity of the situation today is just, is just incredible.
Did the bad guys win today? They got that image. They got
well. They certainly
our attention.
Struck a blow today. There's no question about it. We are a very resilient nation, and we are very resilient people.
And we're a very different people than we were just before 9 o'clock this morning when this all began. Richard Schlesinger, CBS News, New York.
And now to Washington and CBS News Chief White House Correspondent John Roberts. John?
Well, Dan, we have some late-breaking information. After his address from the Oval Office, the president went immediately into a briefing with his national security team. Condoleezza Rice, I believe that Colin Powell may have been there upon his return from South America. A senior administration official telling CBS News tonight that there is good information that Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda group was behind today's terror attacks, Dan. Now, to give you some kind of an idea of just how seriously they were taking security, moving the president around. Some video that came into us late today, taken from inside Air Force One by cameraman George Christian, who was on the plane with the president. You can see outside the wing of the aircraft, Air Force One being shadowed by two fighters. There's an F-16 off of one wing and I believe an F-15 off of the other wing. So, Dan, this was on the way back from Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska as the president was coming back to Andrews. They were definitely taking this seriously, but apparently the president comfortable enough that he's back in the White House tonight. Dan?
John Roberts live at the White House. And so from out of the skies, tragedy has rained down on a nation. It was swift, deliberate, terrifying. In a matter of moments, in one city, a towering American icon was destroyed. And in another, the greatest symbol of our national might was set ablaze. What once seemed unthinkable has happened. On a bright summer morning, under a clear and cloudless sky, terror struck. The toll has been devastating. It may be days or even weeks before the final accounting is done in terms of dead and wounded. To grasp the enormity of it is almost too much for the heart to bear. This night, we can only look back in sorrow at a world that has suddenly, perhaps irrevocably, been changed. And tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, and in days and years to come, we will look at the calendar and remember September 11th, 2001. It is a date that will be etched in history, engraved in stone, and in our memories. The day of the attack on America. We leave you tonight with these images, flashpoints from a day that cannot be forgotten. For the latest on this still unfolding story, stay tuned to this CBS station. There'll be complete coverage on the early show and on the CBS Evening News. And we will have continuing CBS News coverage on some of these stations. On some other stations, we will not see until sometime tomorrow morning. I'm Dan Rather in New York.
From WJXT News Channel 4, this is Eyewitness News.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
An assault on the security of our country.
Oh my God, there it goes!
A catastrophe of unparalleled proportions.
Helpless people at the top of the building, waving their hands, ready to leap out of the building, overcome by smoke.
An untold number of Americans maimed and murdered by what authorities call terrorists and cowards.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the special edition of Eyewitness News. The president told us tonight our nation has seen evil.
We're gathering the latest on this still unfolding drama.
Officials say it'll take weeks before we learn just how many people died from today's terrorist acts. And tonight, federal authorities are identifying known terrorist Osama bin Laden as the prime suspect. We begin our team coverage with CBS News correspondent Drew Levinson.
We are here in Jersey City, New Jersey, across the Hudson River from Lower Manhattan. Behind me, smoke continues to rise from the rubble of what used to be the World Trade Center. This is part of the worst act of terrorism ever on U.S. soil. The horror unimaginable.
We saw a plane coming very low, and everyone said, wow, that plane is very, very low.
The pictures unbelievable.
Oh my God!
And in just a matter of minutes, a giant symbol of American financial power came crumbling down. 2 hijacked airliners loaded with scores of passengers slammed into New York's World Trade Center. The twin 110-story towers set ablaze. The well-coordinated terrorist attack began before 9 o'clock in the morning. The first plane striking the northern tower. Just 15 minutes later, another giant aircraft loaded with fuel slammed into the southern building.
Another one, another plane just hit. Right, oh my God, another plane has just hit.
With New York in shock, the towers then came tumbling down. First, Tower 1.
Top floors collapsed down.
Then, Tower 2. But the devastation didn't end there. Shortly after 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Building 7, home to many Wall Street firms, crashed to the ground. Officials say it will take days to count the number of dead and injured. But with 50,000 workers in the Trade Center alone, New York's mayor says the numbers may be too much to bear. A third plane bound for San Francisco from Newark crashed about 80 miles outside of Pittsburgh. 45 people died in that accident. And also a fourth plane went down at the Pentagon in Washington. That's where my colleague Aline Sergani is. Aline?
Drew, American Airlines Flight 77 from Washington Dulles to Los Angeles slammed into the Pentagon at 9:38 this morning. At this hour, the Pentagon is still on fire. Dozens of emergency search and rescue teams, some from all over the country, are on the site at this hour, but they still can't get to ground zero. 40 minutes after the World Trade Center attacks, the Pentagon met a similar fate. A hijacked American Airlines plane bound for Los Angeles slammed into the Pentagon, causing one wing of the building to collapse. President Bush says he'll use the full resources of the United States to track down those responsible.
We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them.
It happened mid-morning. Witnesses say it looked like a huge orange fireball hit the building.
I couldn't believe that I saw an American Airlines jet just gliding right in to the side of the Pentagon. A huge black billow of smoke came up.
Washington is now under the highest level of security, but officials say even that isn't enough to make any guarantees.
A terrorist can attack at any time, at any place, using any technique. It is physically impossible to defend at every time, in every place, against every technique.
Partly for that reason, much of Washington was shut down, from federal buildings to offices to schools.
God bless America.
The Capitol building was also closed, but members of Congress, hundreds strong, returned to Capitol Hill tonight to say life in Washington will go on.
These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed.
And coming out live now, as you can see, the Pentagon is still on fire. Firefighters say they will spend the whole evening trying to put out the flames you see behind me. They say the building itself is not stable enough to go inside to search for victims. But the Arlington County Fire Chief says his fear is that the death toll could reach as high as 800. In Washington, Aline Sergani, back to you.
And at 11 o'clock tonight, the investigation is going all out. CNN is reporting at this hour that the FBI has obtained search warrants for places they're going to search in South Florida and in Daytona Beach. And they have obtained these search warrants based on information that they obtained from passenger lists. No other details are available. The Federal Aviation Administration says 4 commercial airplanes were involved in today's hijacking. All crashed, 2 into the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, and 1 near Pittsburgh. The 4 airliners were carrying a total of 266 people, and there are no survivors. Here is a list of those flights. American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles. American Airlines Flight 77 from Washington to Los Angeles. United Airlines Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco, and United Airlines Flight 175 from Boston to Los Angeles. The airlines have set up 2 phone lines for relatives of people on those flights. The American Airlines number is 1-800-0999. United Airlines 1-800-932-8555. It may take you a while to get through. Those phone lines have been very busy.
Today's attacks forced the FAA to shut down air traffic in the United States. No commercial flights will fly until at least noon tomorrow at the earliest. Channel 4's Fred Halstead is joining us now live from Jacksonville International Airport. Fred?
Well, Deborah, you can see the planes behind me. The airport is still closed and has been closed for most of the day. Airport officials tell us 25 planes were diverted from various parts throughout the country right here to Jacksonville. Tonight, we hear the stories from a couple of stranded passengers. It's nighttime at Jacksonville International Airport, and this is a scene you don't see often. Scores of airplanes just sitting there, the departure and arrival board showing cancellations.
I'm stuck here until Thursday morning.
The airport is officially closed, which means passengers like Julia Custer are stranded, having to stay at a hotel. She's just one of numerous people using hotels in this area until the airport reopens.
It's kind of a weird tension because I'm trying to go to a job, but there are all these people that have died, and I mean, I feel a lot worse about that than missing my jobs.
Most of the passengers were taken by bus to their final destination in Florida. Others were put up at local hotels near the airport. Many of them say not only are they stranded, but they are frustrated because they say they can't get any answers from the airlines, from the airport, or from the rent-a-car agencies. Airport officials put the airport on what's called a level 4 alert, meaning no airplanes land or take off.
Well, we were detoured to Myrtle Beach.
Hours after the security alert was announced, some passengers were still trying to find ways to get home. These passengers were flying from Philadelphia when the pilot made an emergency landing in Myrtle Beach. They took a bus to Jacksonville. Was there anything the pilot said while you were in the air?
No, he just said that we were going to land at Myrtle Beach. And once we got on the ground, I think at that point he really didn't know until we were on the ground, and then he announced it, and he was like bewildered himself.
Of course, officials here at the airport say the airport could be open as early as tomorrow. That's pending on what the FAA says. For now, we're live at the airport. I'm Fred Halstead.
Well, the brutal attack on Americans is leaving the nation in a state of shock. Many local residents watched in horror as the nightmare unfolded. Channel 4's Bruce Hamilton joins us now live from the South Bank with local reaction. Bruce?
Mary, this is virtually all people across America are talking about tonight, be it around the water cooler, in the library, in a restaurant, in a family living room, in a classroom. The attack on America has consumed this nation. About 2 hours ago, we listened in on a conversation at the VFW post over off St. Augustine Road, VFW 1689. And these vets have some very definitive opinions about what happened today. And if I had to sum up their emotion, it would be one of stunned horror.
Seen the worst disaster of my whole life. I've never, ever, I've been at the World Trade Center, at those buildings. And to see them come down like that, to see that plane come through, in one end and out the other. I'm like, oh no. No. How could this happen in this country?
These men have seen war. Kelly Wright in Panama, the Gulf, Somalia, and Kosovo. George Anderson in Vietnam with Reconnaissance Attack Squad 12 out of the Gulf of Tonkin. And they say these terrorist attacks are acts of war.
Somebody had to be paid off. Well, a lot of people had to be paid off somewhere. And this just didn't happen in the last 2 months. This had to happen. I think this was planned for the last year.
Very well planned and very coordinated. And it happened on a time schedule.
Yeah.
And everybody knew exactly what was going on and exactly what was going to happen. It was too organized.
If you were to eavesdrop on conversations at any other VFW post across the country, or even in your family living rooms, you would hear the same recurring theme. This terrorist attack cannot stand, and people believe that their personal freedoms have been violated.
My stomach is so tied in a knot right now. If what is happening, this is a bacteria on the face of this earth that has to be taken care of.
This is no longer, somebody you just arrest.
Right, you got
this is full-blown out war.
This is it. When we have to strike back, and not just strike back with 2 or 3 sorties. We got to strike back 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to show these people that they can't come to our country and do this to us.
Now, they went on one step further. They said if indeed Osama bin Laden is responsible, and reports lead us in that direction that one of his splinter groups is responsible and behind these terrorist attacks, we not only have to, quote, take him out, their words, we have to deal with the people who have harbored and protected him until now. Mary?
Well, Bruce, as you said, discussion on this tragedy spans generations, from the veterans that you were talking to back to the living room with moms and dads trying to explain it to their own kids. terrorism is not easy to explain.
No, it is a very harsh reality that our children have to deal with. If I can get a bit personal here for a moment, I have 4 young boys, and I talked to my oldest who's in high school, and he said, you know, it was really weird, Dad. This morning they put us on what they call red alert, and we had to hide under our desks, and we didn't know what was going on. We kind of thought it was like a fire drill, but then we saw what was happening on the TV, and we realized that they were preparing us for every eventuality. And then my 12-year-old Greg asked me, he says, Dad, what were they trying to do? Why didn't they go after the Statue of Liberty if they were trying to insult our freedom? And I said, you know what, Greg, that's a very well thought out question for a young man of your age. And I had to think for a minute about what my answer was. And I said, the Statue of Liberty is a symbol of freedom, but the World Trade Center is a symbol of America's might, of American capitalism, of America's greatness. And these terrorists set out to prove a point. And the point was that they could bring America and the world to its knees and a grinding halt. And he paused thoughtfully for a moment, and he said, they're not going to do that, are they, Dad? And I said, no, Greg, they're not going to do that.
All right, Bruce Hamilton, thank you.
Local military bases are on the highest state of alert tonight, and the Mayport-based USS John F. Kennedy is reported to be on its way to New York. Channel 4's Stacey Spanos is joining us now live from Mayport with more on how today's events are affecting local military men and women. Stacey?
Tom, the streets of Mayport are relatively quiet tonight. That is because earlier today, everyone you can assume is probably at home with their loved ones gathered around, glued to the television set watching as these just terrible events unfolded. Earlier today, all non-essential military personnel were asked to leave Naval Station Mayport, as they were at NAS Jacksonville today, and they were told to get out of here until further notice. And it was very busy going in because all essential military personnel were asked to come back and to be ready for anything. Getting onto base at Mayport Naval Station was like going through a maze, literally. Concrete barricades were set up to slow drivers down. The actions were taken when all military bases across the country were put on Delta status, the highest level of security. In this Navy town, it wasn't hard to find people watching coverage of these horrific events. It wasn't hard either to find people who wanted to talk about it.
I was terrified. I couldn't believe it. It looks like a movie. It doesn't look like it's real.
That's the sentiment of many people. At the local grocery store, employee Sean Campbell says it's all anyone could talk about.
There was a lot of people that came in tonight that were very worked up and asked our opinions about it.
And most people in this town, a town where sailors live and sleep, had an opinion on what the U.S. should do now.
Whatever needs to be done. You know, I mean, we got to stand up. You know, I was in the service myself back in the early 80s, but, you know, you got to stand up. You just can't back down, so we got to do something about it.
These people are not over here just fooling with us. If we don't get off it and do something, they're going to do it back.
Thousands of USS Kennedy sailors boarded that ship today. We have been told by the spouses of those sailors that they were deploying on a routine mission, but that routine mission has since been scrapped. And those sailors have been sent up to the New York area. In what capacity, we don't know, whether to provide security or whether to provide any medical assistance. As for Naval Air Station Jacksonville, we know that all essential personnel, as I told you, were being asked to come back. But whether any of them left the base tonight, we have not been told. The Navy is keeping very quiet, understandably, about that. Jim Piggott has been covering the city's response to all this chaos. We join him now live. Jim.
The city was hit hard by this tragedy today. Now, city officials say they're standing by to help out wherever they can. Now, what they're doing is they have crews on standby from the fire department, hoping that they could help out and be called to serve up there. Now, the mayor says that they want to do that, and they went to the business to make sure that we are safe today.
Our wariness is up.
City officials met at various times throughout the day to assess the situation in Jacksonville. Downtown, security was beefed up near the federal buildings, and police say they've been asked to make their presence known.
We've had a number of requests from city officials to increase security at some of our public buildings, and certainly we are continuing to do that.
The word from Mayor Delaney is to follow the lead of the president and try to get things back to normal. The Emergency Operations Center was staffed most of the day. City offices and the courts stayed open. Now, they're planning for the same thing on Wednesday.
We do anticipate taking stock tomorrow. Again, all law enforcement is a little more wary now.
I spoke with General Fryer just about 15-20 minutes ago, the superintendent of the school system. The plans there are to have school as normal tomorrow. The word we're getting also from the area businesses, several of the tall office towers had some divisions that went ahead and sent their people home, and the word that has come back to us is that they will be operating as normal tomorrow. Obviously, if you're employed in the private ranks, you'd want to check with your employer. We do anticipate city services being open tomorrow.
These Jacksonville firefighters are part of a special unit trained to handle emergencies like we saw today. They're standing by, ready to offer aid if necessary.
What we've been trained to do is we've trained over 100 of our firefighters locally to respond to building collapses, trench rescue, basically host traumatic incidents to a building.
The Emergency Operations Center was on a level 1 status today. That's closed for this evening, but they plan to reopen tomorrow during normal business hours if they are needed. We're live from the South Bank. I'm Jim Piggott.
Florida Governor Jeb Bush is declaring a state of emergency, saying it is a preemptive response to ensure that Florida is prepared for anything. The executive order activates an emergency plan that increases security around our state.
America is a great nation. Its greatness is revealed most clearly in times of crisis. In times when we're challenged, we must not despair in this present challenge. We must be strong.
The state capitol was closed and evacuated shortly after the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and at the Pentagon. But the governor says government offices and public universities and colleges will reopen tomorrow.
The attacks also forced the closing of Florida's most popular tourist attraction, Walt Disney World. Disney, along with most of the state's theme parks, closed shortly after today's attacks. Visitors and employees were cleared as a precautionary security measure. All Disney hotels remain open. A spokesperson says visitors who were forced to leave the park today will get complimentary tickets to return. Disney officials are still not sure if they will continue with plans for upcoming Disney cruises. Kennedy Space Center was also shut down today as a precaution. The space agency sent its 12,000 workers home and closed its main spaceport. The Kennedy Space Center is now under an unprecedented security blanket.
Words are just inadequate to describe what the nation witnessed this morning, and the pictures we saw today are simply ghastly. They are chilling. We have put together some of the most telling scenes as they were recorded by news cameras and amateur photographers. Less than 20 minutes after the first attack, a plume of smoke was high over the skyline of Manhattan, and now you're looking at the second plane as it plows into the second tower of the World Trade Center. Cameras all over. There is another picture of the same event. Cameras all over New York recorded the absolutely indescribable catastrophe. People just couldn't believe what they were seeing. Columns of smoke now rising, and there it is again as the plane knifed into the second tower of the World Trade Center with a huge fireball. As I said, cameras all over New York were trained on the building. People couldn't believe what it was they were seeing. Clyde Eubanks, the vice president of an insurance company, was at a meeting on the 103rd floor of the South Tower of the World Trade Center when his boss said, "Look at that. Look at that." He turned and saw a plane go by and hit the other tower. But the worst was yet to come. At 9:50 this morning, just an hour after the attack began, One World Trade Center, the North Tower, collapses onto the street below. The pictures taken from the high-up cameras show it. It's indescribable. But the pictures taken also from the ground where debris and ash and plaster and paper just rained down on people, rescue workers who were below. This is the scene. This is what they saw as this building came tumbling down. The North Tower of the World Trade Center, which was the first building struck by an airliner. First, the outside of the building comes down, and then the skeleton of the building collapses in a pile of indescribable rubble. New Yorkers stood there and looked. They could not believe what they were seeing. Another camera from another angle recorded the same catastrophe. A man named Peter DeSerbo, who had led 44 colleagues down 47 flights of stairs, got into the street, staggered from the building. His clothes were torn. Workers were stunned. They were dazed. They were coughing. Another survivor said, "The minute I got out of the building, the second building blew up." It was just absolutely indescribable. The streets below looked like a war zone. People who absolutely could not believe the experience they'd been through. Look at the expression on this woman's face. She's completely covered with dust. These are people who they can't believe that they're still alive.
I was in the restroom. There was a big shaking. Some of the ceilings collapsed.
Looks like there was a fire in the elevator shafts, and they brought everyone down and started bringing everybody down the stairs.
And then more panic in the streets. At 10:29 this morning, the second tower of the World Trade Center collapsed. The top of the building exploded with smoke and dust. There were no flames, just an explosion of debris and dust and smoke, and then more vast clouds swept down into the streets. People were knocked to the ground onto their faces as they were running from the building toward cover. And then the same huge clouds of smoke, dust, and debris came through the building and blocked out the sun. We are working tonight to bring you complete coverage of this American tragedy. In fact, we are simulcasting this coverage right now with the help of WB17. And updated information is always just a few clicks away on our website, news4jax.com. There you will find the very latest information. You can also take part in an emotional discussion about today's attack.
These pictures are just remarkable.
People all around the nation, people all around our country today, the entire population is focused on this unbelievable event today.
And people in our community and communities all over were gathering to pray, and Sam Kavaris was out talking to some of those people, some parishioners tonight.
A lot of parishioners felt like that the one thing they could do was go to church. Religious leaders throughout the world have called on many of their followers to go and pray for not only the families, but also the victims as well. Many people felt like that the one place that they wanted to be today was with their community, somewhere praying together.
Churches throughout the city opened their doors for prayer today, much like Most Holy Redeemer Catholic Church on Jacksonville's west side, where Bishop Victor Gallone of the Catholic Diocese of St. Augustine celebrated a Mass for Peace.
As Mahatma Gandhi says, that we have to be willing to drop all violence, and he, through nonviolent means, liberated a whole continent, practically, India.
You just try to make sense out of a world that unfortunately is still very sinful and still in need of that redemptive love of Christ, and I believe that that's what we've got to keep praying for tonight.
Parishioners filled the pews early and offered their prayers. Many said they felt a sense of community and mutual support.
We're a people of faith, and we're about building community. We're about building the kingdom, and that's why we're here even in the face of adversity.
Is this somewhat of a signal as well to show that we're still together, we're still family?
Oh, yes. We certainly
Nations always pull
together when it comes to a tragedy like this. The good old United States pull together.
Right.
We'll come through.
The bishop called for justice to be served, but echoed other religious leaders, saying the circle of violence must stop.
But unfortunately, the human heart, as Jeremiah says, is more treacherous than any other thing on this world. And I can speak from my own past experience, my own life, I mean, that it is so easy to rationalize, say, wait a minute, it's not my fault. I'm only paying back. They started it.
Many people that I spoke to today found a certain amount of irony in the fact that in times of crisis, the President of the United States, with all the talk of separation of church and state here in our country, asks people consistently to pray, and that's where U.S. citizens usually end up in times of crisis, and that's in church if they're not in front of their television.
And this, of course, was repeated in churches and synagogues.
Everywhere.
Everywhere.
And it was interesting, I saw numerous religious leaders throughout the world today talk about the fact that the circle of violence, and they all said that, yes, justice should be served, that these people should be brought to justice, but the retribution aspect is something that has to be finally stopped, and whether it means eradicating the people who are consistently perpetrating these acts or something else, but that's where, they said it's the constant back and forth that leads to the terrible American and worldwide tragedies like this.
So many people, so many people come together for sport activities. I mean, the football games.
Right.
What can you tell us about those?
They haven't made a lot of decisions yet. Some NFL games, some college games have already been postponed. We'll talk more about the NFL and Tom Coughlin's experience today, his son Brian and his son Tim. His son Tim works at the World Trade Center. He is okay, and it is a story that you won't forget.
Thank you, Sam.
Okay.
The specific numbers of dead and injured will not be known for several days. What is known is that New York City hospitals were overwhelmed with victims, and those hospitals need blood. Jacksonville is doing what it can to answer that need. Channel 4's Ted Brown has the story from the Red Cross Center in Riverside.
Once people have gotten over the initial shock and rage at an attack like this,
their next reaction is one of compassion. They want to help. If they're wondering how they can do that, they can come to or contact the American Red Cross.
American Red Cross.
Reuniting families and friends is the first priority of Jacksonville's Red Cross.
American Red Cross.
The caller is looking for someone they think may be a victim of this tragedy. Staff and volunteers take the information and pass it along to the national office, who will try to locate that person for them. The second priority is blood. The Florida-Georgia Blood Alliance is being flooded with volunteers doing what they can to help.
We were at work and we heard about the situation, and we saw at the bottom of the screen that they needed blood. So a bunch of us decided to come on down.
Because of suspended airline flights, a special courier is taking blood from the Blood Alliance to New York this evening. The Red Cross is taking money donations and blood. Both go directly to the victims in New York and Washington.
The blood would be there. They've already let New York and everyone know, of course, that we'll be available to ship units if they call on us.
Again, donations of money and blood go from the American Red Cross directly to the victims and the families of the victims of this tragedy. If you want to help, contact the Red Cross or come here to their office in Riverside. Reporting from Riverside, I'm Ted Brown.
And here's how you make that donation. Send it to the Disaster Relief Fund, Northeast Chapter of the American Red Cross. That's at 751 Riverside Avenue in Jacksonville, 32204. Also on Thursday, there will be a Red Cross donation drive from 6 in the morning until 10 in the morning at Alltel Stadium. That money will go to the Red Cross Disaster Fund.
Touched by the tragedy, people in our area came out in droves to try to help the survivors of the attacks. The Kingsley Blood Donation Center in Orange Park was overrun tonight with people wanting to help. Police were even called in to control heavy traffic. Good Samaritans had to wait outside and be called in to give blood. One woman tells us she doesn't mind the wait.
So many people here that they're having to wait for hours to do it. I just got here, but there's people that have been here for hours and hours, and it's just the outpour of the community is just tremendous here. I just can't get over it. It's just amazing.
The center says it will be taking donations through the rest of the week. If you'd like to give blood, the Florida-Georgia Blood Alliance is having a blood drive tomorrow morning. That's from 8 in the morning until 10 o'clock at 2153 Kingsley Avenue.
Our coverage of today's terrorist attack will continue in just a moment, but first we want to call on Brian to give us a look at the weather. Brian?
That's right, the weather continues, and we do have a situation kind of developing out in the Gulf of Mexico as well. Tropical Depression number 8, which could become Tropical Storm Gabrielle. We've been watching this low pressure now for the past couple of days. It's brought some heavy rains for Central and South Florida. Taking a look at Doppler 4.0, we've had those passing showers since early this morning, off and on all day. Just downpours of rain, but the rain is starting to add up around some areas, at least a ½ inch to over an inch and a half in some locations around town. And it's beginning to wind down a little bit, but there's still some shower activity offshore and obviously to the south of us. The center of this storm right now just off of Fort Myers, and it's going to stay over the open waters, which is very warm. And when you have that situation, you're going to have to, this time of year, you have to watch it very carefully as it could become a tropical storm, and that is what they are thinking over the next couple of days. Here's the center. Here's a cool front to help kind of kick off those showers as well, but the main problem, once again, will be this low pressure as it slowly tracks to the north and to the northeast over the next couple of days. There's Hurricane Erin. We're also watching what became Tropical Storm Felix this afternoon, but the good news, already making the turn to the north and should remain over the open Atlantic and not affecting anyone, which is excellent news. But all eyes are once again here in the southeast, where it is more than likely this will become Tropical Storm Gabrielle, probably not tomorrow, but maybe over the next couple of days. And we are on the eastern side of it, which is the wet side. So there will be flooding rains from central and southern Florida tomorrow, and it'll gradually work its way up the peninsula for Thursday and Friday, and maybe even into Saturday for us. By Sunday, though, things should start to calm down. But because the storm will more than likely have winds of around 40 miles per hour, our winds will pick up starting tomorrow and through Saturday. Probably a nor'easter will be around here as well with those gusty winds and the heavy rainfall as well for the next couple of days. Because of that, a small craft advisory has been issued. The winds will pick up between 15 and 25, seas building 4 to 7 feet. The surf will be on the rise as well as the rip currents, surf 4 to 5 feet. The inland waters a moderate chop, becoming choppy late in the day, and your high tide is just before 4:50 in the evening. So mostly cloudy and still some showers by morning. Temperatures will be in the lower 70s, and by afternoon, mostly cloudy, downpours likely, and windy. Temperatures in the mid-80s, and then for the rest of the week, an excellent chance of rain, 70 to 80% with windy conditions, and then starting to dry out by Saturday and Sunday.
Once again, you are watching a special hour-long extended edition of Eyewitness News Night Beat.
And some of you are watching this newscast simulcast on Channel 17.
Here's a recap now of how the attack on America unfolded this morning. At 9 o'clock, an airliner slammed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. Just minutes later, another plane hit the North Tower. Around 9:30, all air traffic nationwide was canceled. And President Bush speaks to the nation, saying that we will, quote, hunt down and punish those responsible for these acts.
30 minutes later, a plane crashes into the Pentagon. Shortly after that, the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. And at 10:30, the North Tower gave way. And also, before 11 o'clock, another hijacked plane crashes near Pittsburgh in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. Then at 12:30 this afternoon, the U.S. borders were closed.
As we told you just a few minutes ago, CNN is reporting that the FBI tonight is serving search warrants in South Florida and in Daytona Beach. For the latest on the investigation of this terrorist attack, here now is reporter Skip Lozier from Washington.
President Bush calls today's terrorist attacks evil, despicable acts that have left Americans with a deep sense of sadness and a quiet, unyielding anger. President Bush addresses a stunned and frightened nation in the wake of terrorist attacks that have left Americans reeling.
America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. And no one will keep that light from shining.
Mr. Bush called the attacks cowardly and pledged to track down those responsible and punish them.
The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice.
Never before has the United States suffered such a horrific terrorist attack. The worst of it was in New York City, where a hijacked airliner slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center and exploded. 18 minutes later, another hijacked airliner crashed into the South Tower, leaving an untold number of people injured and dead. A short time later, as Americans watched, both towers collapsed, sending debris and bodies raining down on the streets below. Here in Washington, a third hijacked airliner took aim at the Pentagon, blasting its way through the outer ring of the office building where the Army is located, igniting a fire which continues to burn well into the afternoon. The Pentagon, the Capitol, the State Department, and other government buildings were evacuated, and a state of emergency was declared. The president says he makes no distinction between those who commit terrorist acts and those who harbor them. And he says the U.S. military is powerful and prepared. We're live in Washington. I'm Skip Lozier.
Many local families watched the events in New York unfold with a sense of horror and disbelief. A Jacksonville brother and sister watched and waited for word on a niece who worked towards the top of the World Trade Center. Channel 4's Joyce Morgan has their story.
Total fear. Total, just my heart fell. I know I have relatives there, not just for my relatives, but so many people. I have a niece that works there on one of the top floors, and from all the destruction that I've seen, I refuse to think anything other than positive thoughts. She's in God's hands is what I believe.
Margaret Presley is describing her emotional tug of war. She saw the events unfold at the World Trade Center, where her niece worked as an administrative assistant. She decided to keep working, though, at Regency to stay composed.
Just stay positive. I don't have any answers about what's happening. I have family there. Okay, I don't know what the situation is, but I'm only going to think positive thoughts.
Her brother, Larry Presley, also works at the mall. He spent hours on the phone trying to reach family members in New York.
I have been trying to get a hold of somebody. Just so, when I saw what happened, just so I could find out what happened or if anybody in my family was affected.
While the details continue to unfold, the speculation continues to run rampant.
I got a hold of my brother's wife, and she told me that he was in the city. He wasn't close enough to really be affected by it, but he did get a lot of the fallout. So he did get the smoke and the powder effect, and that now about the worst thing for him is that he can't get back out of New York City.
For now, there's no word yet on their niece, but the Presleys say they have a new sense of peace now that some family members have been located. Joyce Morgan, Channel 4 Eyewitness News.
And since Joyce filed this report, we do have some good news to report. The family told us tonight they finally were able to contact their niece, and she is safe.
As we mentioned, the attack is also affecting local military men and women. The Mayport base, John F. Kennedy, is on its way to New York Harbor, along with the USS George Washington. Local bases also are on the highest state of alert, as are all bases in America. Stacey Spanos is joining us once again, now live from Mayport. Stacey?
Deborah, the Navy understandably is not talking too much about any military positions or on the movement of any of their sailors based here at Naval Station Mayport. The information we have been able to glean has been mostly from spouses of sailors. They told us the sailors aboard the USS Kennedy were going on a routine mission, a routine deployment, but that deployment has since been diverted, and they are now going on up to the New York area, whether to serve as security purposes or medical purposes. You're looking at a picture now of Naval Air Station Jacksonville, and what struck us was all of the airplanes lined up on the runway. You know something is amiss in that neighborhood, because today, all day today, you did not hear one airplane take off or one airplane land. As we were sitting out there for a few hours, we did hear one jet rev up, but that was about it. Out here at Mayport, people are still in a state of disbelief, and they realize this is hit very close to home.
A lot of our JFK, then we find out they're going down that way, and they're like a small family to us. You know, they come in here, we do their clothes, and we talk to them, and just for them for this to be going on, I can't believe it.
I have family members in New York, so I immediately called New York, and I got a sister that works downtown D.C. area, and I called there and see if everybody was all right. But it's crazy, huh?
I know I talked about this earlier today. As I was out at Naval Air Station Jacksonville, there was a young sailor sitting down next to me, and as I turned to leave, I caught his eyes. He had the bluest eyes, but they were tinged with red. You can tell he had been emotional throughout the day, and the look of determination, just the determination of saving his country and fighting for his country was burning in his eyes. I also had an opportunity to speak with a friend of mine we have a mutual friend who was flying out of Amsterdam about 8 o'clock local time this morning. He said they got about halfway to their destination. They were going to Detroit when the pilot told them that they were having a hydraulic problem. They would have to go back to Amsterdam. Well, when they got to Amsterdam, they found out the real reason that they had gone back, and that was because of this terrorist attack, what's being called a terrorist attack. And you can understand just how visibly shaken they were watching those reports over the TV in the monitors in the airport. We're live at NAS Jackson, or rather at Mayport Naval Station. I'm Stacey Spanos.
Airports all over the country are also on high alert tonight. Air traffic is suspended at least until noon tomorrow. Channel 4's Fred Halstead is rejoining us now live from the airport with how stranded travelers took all of this. Fred?
Well, Tom, first of all, I want to tell you, set the scene for you. It's really weird when you come out here to the airport. Most of us are used to seeing the planes taxiing on the runway, or the passengers out here bustling, people grabbing bags. Right now, there's no one out here. The airport is officially closed and has been so all day. So it's kind of strange to come out here and see just news crews or people like us out here right now. But the airport is on a heightened sense of security. They're at a level 4 alert. That basically means no planes landing or taking off. As you can see, many of the people who were obviously on those planes were stranded. They were put up at local hotels. That's the scene tonight. A lot of the airplanes just sitting there right now, not moving. Also inside the airport, you can see the arrival and departure board has the cancellations. Because of the heightened security, the level 4, like I mentioned, airport security used K9s to do what they call a clean sweep of the airport. Also, a lot of those passengers were stranded here. They had to be put up at local motels. Many of them say they were frustrated because they weren't receiving any answers.
It's a little confusing. There's no one to ask what to do. Nobody knows. I mean, the airlines don't know, the travel agent doesn't know, you know.
Oddly enough, a lot of the people we talk to say despite today's horrific events, they really have no reservations about flying in the future. Also, as far as the employees out here, you are encouraged, if you do work at Jacksonville International Airport, you are encouraged to call the airport to see exactly what the status is. Also, airport officials tell us that they could be open as early as tomorrow. All that, of course, depends on what the FAA decides to do. That's the latest from the airport. I'm Fred Halstead.
Well, all around our community, people are coming together to deal with this tragedy. And in Jacksonville, city leaders mapped out a plan to make sure Jacksonville stays safe. Let's go back live to Eyewitness News reporter Jim Piggott, who's at the South Bank. And Jim, you spoke with city leaders earlier today. Can you tell us more of what they had to say?
Well, the Emergency Operations Center, that was in operation throughout most of the day as city leaders were trying to determine the status and what happened here to make sure that we were safe. Now, security was increased around some downtown buildings Extra police were called in, particularly around the federal building, but the city buildings remained open, and that as part of the plan for tomorrow as well. School as well will be open here in Duval County. Now, the city is ready to lend a hand where it is necessary. Specially trained firefighters are standing by to help out if needed.
Still continuing to look at our capability of responding if we are asked to do so. Beyond that, it's business as usual.
City officials say they will be back at the Emergency Operations Center tomorrow, but at normal business hours, they're taking this one day at a time. From the South Bank, I'm Jim Piggott.
Federal officials say it will be business as usual tomorrow, even though these attacks happened quite a distance away from Jacksonville. As Channel 4's Heather Van Nest shows us, federal employees here felt the effects.
With almost 2,000 federal employees working in downtown Jacksonville and building security at its highest, many employees got permission to leave in the morning. Federal employee Doris Marlin says right now her focus is on family.
It's hard to concentrate, and many of us have children, school-aged children, that this is a day that will go down in history, no different than the assassination of JFK. I want to be with my family.
Nobody's doing anything. We're all up there watching TV monitors and trying to stay informed, and so nothing productive's happening, let me put it that way. So you might as well leave.
One of the first groups sent home construction workers here at the new federal courthouse. That allowed officers to better secure this area. At the federal courthouse and Charles E. Bennett Federal Building, which houses many agencies, including the IRS and Army Corps of Engineers, security officers closed backdoor entrances, forcing everyone entering the building to go through a beefed-up security checkpoint. The head of security for all federal property in Jacksonville says officers are scouring the buildings inside and out, looking for anything suspicious.
We're constantly trying to keep people calm and keep people informed.
We have the armed guard going around the outside of the building. He's going to also check around the marshal's car to be sure that they are secure, that there isn't a problem with it.
Then, around 2 o'clock, official word came. All federal buildings would be closed. With the city's emergency preparedness plan also in place, Mayor John Delaney had this to say.
Does not appear to be credible threats to those of us in Florida. But obviously, we must proceed very, very cautiously over the next few hours and few days.
Heather Van Nest, Channel 4 Eyewitness News.
Some local businesses and government agencies, including the IRS, had offices in the World Trade Center.
The shock, of course, is still sinking in for all of us. We're never going to forget what was done to our country today. Bruce Hamilton has been out tonight getting reaction, and Bruce is joining us live again from the South Bank. Bruce?
Tom, there is a three-letter word that's at the root of many of the questions being asked tonight. How did these hijackers breach security? How did they commandeer 4 airplanes in such a short time span? And third, how did this happen? Now, tonight we visited the VFW post 1689 over off St. Augustine Road, and the vets I talked to there said, you know what, we may never know the answer to those questions, but we do know one thing. We do know that the U.S. reaction has to be direct and swift.
I'm definitely wondering how this could happen here. All our anti-terrorism that we supposedly have, the CIA, the FBI, the military intelligence, where were they?
It made Pearl Harbor look like peanuts.
Oh yeah, because at least they went after military.
Right.
And I mean, at least, you know, when we're all in uniform, we're paid to serve our country and pay the ultimate dues. These people in New York.
They were just innocent people going to work, 9 o'clock in the morning, 10 to 9, one plane hits, and they look up, and here comes another plane.
Yeah, and you think of the towers, all right, they got 50,000 employees in those 2 towers. They got nurseries for their children in those 2 towers.
We thought Oklahoma was the worst thing possible to ever happen.
Why?
This is the worst thing that's happened in the United States.
This is the most devastating thing that's happened in the United States.
One final note here, there's a youngster who I talked with who said, you know, that picture we see of the plane crashing into the World Trade Center, it keeps playing over and over again in my mind, kind of like a videotape. It's a nightmare. I hope I don't have nightmares. And the person that was with him said, son, this is America's nightmare.
Thank you, Bruce. As news of today's terrorist attacks spread, so did the shock. State leaders in Tallahassee were noticeably shaken and concerned. Late this afternoon, Governor Bush declared a state of emergency, calling it a preemptive response to terrorist attacks. Channel 4's John Lucas has the story from Tallahassee.
As news of the terrorist attack spread, police began stopping and checking vehicles outside the state capitol. Inside, legislators in town for committee meetings watched their televisions in disbelief.
It's just incredible that there are folks in this world that's desperate as to take innocent lives like this. It's devastating.
Across town, the governor and members of the cabinet cut short their cabinet meeting.
This is a sad day for our country.
Security around the governor was increased. Authorities feared for his safety because of his family ties to the president.
Our governor is the brother of the leader of the free world, and that naturally raises